Good morning and welcome to History of Interiors. Today we will be starting Unit 2, which features the Italian Renaissance and French styles. While presented in new ways, you will recognize many of the elements that we will look at in this unit, as many ancient styles served as inspiration throughout later history. Today we will be looking at the Italian Renaissance, which is known as a time of immense cultural growth. You will likely recognize many of the buildings and decorative arts that we will study today, as the Renaissance has been exalted throughout history. So to give you a little bit of background knowledge on this, the Italian Renaissance began as the opening phase of the Renaissance at large, and that began in Florence, Italy, towards the end of the 13th century, and it lasted until about 1600 CE. This was a time of exceptional growth culturally, scientifically, artistically, and politically, and many of the innovative Renaissance figures are still studied today, so it's incredibly influential, and that's why I'm going to be honest with you, this long lecture is going to be a little bit longer than most, but feel free to pause it at any time. But yes, like I said, this is an immensely important area of growth. We're going to see growth in almost every facet of society. And so you'll notice that this is a great period of cultural change and achievement in Europe, and this marks the transition between the medieval and early modern Europe. So it's kind of that gap, that bridge between the modern era and those ancient and medieval times. So, as I mentioned just a moment ago, in the Italian Renaissance, we see different areas of growth across society. So, we're going to specifically look at those in 8 different ways, and we'll dive into each of these a little bit deeper in a moment. But you're going to see significant growth in the geographic aspects, the economic aspects, the scientific and historical aspects, as well as religious, artistic, philosophic, and political aspects of society. So all of these things are going to start to shift and change towards the end of the Middle Ages, and that's what's really going to lead to the Renaissance. So through a lot of scientific discovery, a lot of religious outcry, like I said, there's going to be a lot of shifting and shaping and all of the stuff moving around. And that's going to cause this massive, massive growth towards a greater society, which we term as the Renaissance. So, in terms of geography, Florence, Italy was the birthplace of the Renaissance. And that's going to be up in that Tuscany area of almost northern Italy, kind of central, but more north than south. And then Florence is important because it is located on the trade route to the Middle East and down towards India and China. So all of those major trade routes that connect the East and the West passed through Florence, which gave them a really great understanding of the world around them. They were by no means isolated. They had every possible aspect towards building a society that was truly globally based. And then buyers would travel to the Far East annually, so it was a trip that was made fairly often. It definitely would have taken a long time. We didn't have any form of steam engine at this point, but they would make those trips as often as they could. And then the Renaissance movement began in Florence, but it would later shift to Rome. So Florence does get most of the credit for this, but Rome is by no means left out. It is still a very important Italian city that we're going to continue to see time and time again. So this is a map that gives you a very, very basic understanding of how those trade routes would have passed through. So you can see that they came all the way up to the Kingdom of England and out past the Ottoman Empire, connecting that east and western viewpoint, and all of that would have passed right around Italy. So I'm going to show you right here in green in this general area, that's where you're going to see Florence. And so, as you can tell, it's going to have a lot of influence because it is so central. It's a pretty easy path to get north and a pretty easy path to get to the east. So they are going to have a very easy time becoming that central location for the Renaissance to form. So this map, you can just look at Italy a little bit closer. So like I said, it's more to the north than to the south in terms of Florence's location, but it is still fairly centralized. It's not right by an ocean, so it's not going to have any of those seaports that we would have seen in Pisa or really even in Rome, but it's right here. This little dot specifically, and that's going to be where all of this main initiation basically of the Renaissance comes into play. So there's going to be a lot of really important discoveries made there, as well as a lot of really important artistic achievements that are all going to be centrally located in Florence. And we'll go into a little bit more detail as to why Florence was able to thrive as well. But it's really going to be a powerhouse in terms of economic, scientific, artistic, and political achievements. So that's really what leads Florence to become this really major power player here, even though it is a much smaller city than Rome. But like I said, eventually all of those artists from Florence are going to travel down to Rome. Rome is by no means fading away, but like I said, all of that influence, it's going to shift up to Florence to begin the Renaissance. So now we're going to talk about the economic facets that led to Italy becoming the home for the Renaissance, and this one's going to be pretty important. So because it was so centrally located and it had such a great location along those merchant trade routes, Italy became the main banking center for Europe. And this is going to have a lot to do, like I said, with those trade routes, but also a lot to do with the church. So if you'll remember, the Catholic Church has a really big influence at this time. You haven't yet seen that Protestant Reformation. That's on the brink, but it's not quite here yet. So having access to the Vatican, money would have been flowing into Europe, but more specifically into Rome, into that Vatican city, and by association the rest of Italy as well. Though it is important to note, Italy was not united at this time. They're actually still a collection of different city-states, basically. So just because all of the money was going towards the Vatican doesn't necessarily mean that every other Italian city-state would have benefited directly from that economic growth. But because of their place along the merchant trade routes, as well as all of that money going inwards towards the Vatican, you do see a great amount of economic growth in Italy that you wouldn't have seen in other areas such as England or really even France. Now we're going to dive into the scientific discoveries of the Renaissance. There were many, but we're just going to go over a couple here. So first and most importantly, they discovered that the Earth is not flat, but it is in fact a sphere. They discovered this in 1492. And then they also learned that the Earth actually revolves around the sun rather than vice versa. So there were a lot of astronomical events that took place, which caused them to reevaluate the science that they believed to be true. They also invented the compass, so using that gravitational pull, they were able to determine, which way is north using this new device that they created, which helped a lot as we continue to expand our horizons and travel around the globe via ships. And then lastly, they also invented the printing press, which is incredibly important because you'll remember from our last couple of lectures that the general population was very uneducated, and part of that has to do with access to educational materials. So by using printing presses rather than having someone who actually has to handwrite out every single book, they were able to spread revival of the classics from those ancient cultures, and have a lot more entertainment as well as a lot more education than we had seen in those Middle Age styles. So, as I mentioned, they were able to revive all of those classic poems. So you see the Iliad and some of those others making their way around the globe again. And this also led to entertainment value. So, in general, they had a higher quality of life than they did during the Gothic times, when very, very few people in the population could read at all. So, this slide further details why the invention of the printing press was important. It is one of the 100 greatest events of the millennium, according to some. And then the Bible was actually the first book to be published on the Gutenberg printing press. And remember that in this time, religion would have been entirely central to who people were, which makes sense because oftentimes, we turn to religion to explain the things that we really have no other explanation for. And so, in a time where they didn't necessarily have access to all of the same information that we do, as well as just the world being generally unexplainable, it was pretty common for people to turn to different religions, but specifically Christianity, which was still in a massive time of growth during the Renaissance. So, the Bible would have been one of the essentials to distribute. You wanted to get it in as many households as possible because it was so central to their daily lives. So, the historical context of this time, it's important to note that this was preceded by the Gothic period. So, as much as I love to talk about the Gothic period and how it was actually oftentimes misconstrued, it was all about light, all about letting that light and sunshine in. The truth of the matter is, it was a pretty rough time to be alive. You had plague, you had famine, that feudal system led to a lot of conflict. So while they were trying to bring light into their architecture and trying to bring light into their life, ultimately it was a pretty rough existence. So during the Renaissance, people kind of turned away from that severity and that negative emotions that were tied to life, and they started to really want to enjoy living again. Now, there are going to be a lot of medical advances that takes care of some of that, so you're not going to see the bubonic plague running around the way it had been during the Middle Ages. But they're not going to be able to solve every aspect of that. That feudal system is still going to be around, and we're still going to see a lot of conflict among different communities. So, just something to keep note of while they were trying to turn away from that and they really wanted to find a really enjoyable life. That wasn't necessarily the way that it went down every single time. There is still going to be a lot of conflict, but in general, they wanted a happier existence than they had seen during the Middle Ages. So now we're going to talk about the religious facet that caused the Renaissance. And this is going to arguably lead to the most instability of all of the different facets that lead to the Renaissance. So you have a lot of scientific findings that conflict with the claims of the church. And so, that's something that we still experience and see today, but you'll notice that a lot of the intellectual people of the Renaissance really wanted to do away with the mysticism of the church. So they wanted to separate the church and science because everything that they were learning in science was really conflicting to all of those Old Testament as well as some of the New Testament ideas that they had learned about in the church. And so, like I said, that's a conflict that's going to continue over centuries as this all plays out. But ultimately, just note that a lot of the scientific developments and findings don't necessarily support everything that's in the Bible, and that leads to a lot of conflict, especially when you consider how strong the papacy was at this point. So oftentimes people would protest the church's authority over secular matters. So the church was very powerful in the Middle Ages, but ultimately, when it came to the Renaissance, people decided we want to be able to build our own scientific discoveries, we want to form our own philosophical ideas. And that can sometimes be within bounds of the church, but things that don't really involve religion don't need to be mixed in with the papacy. Um, and so you're going to see Savonarola, who's a monk, and he's going to try to reform the church, but he ultimately ends up being burned at the stake in 1498. And then you're going to have Martin Luther, who began the Protestant Reformation, and that's going to begin really at the end of the Renaissance. It's going to be pretty much the thing that causes the Renaissance to fall apart a little bit. And we'll look at Martin Luther in a bit more detail on the next slide. But when I say that you have a lot of religious instability, just remember the church is having to face a lot of criticism at this point because it does have those teachings that conflict with everything that we're learning. And it's also going to cause a lot of harm to a lot of people. The more power that someone gets, the more ability they have to oppress others. And that's something that we're going to see become quite common within the use of the Christian church. And so Martin Luther's going to throw all of that out of the window. He's going to come at the idea of the Christian religion in a completely different way than the Catholic Church and the way that the Catholic Church had it set up. And he's going to denounce the Pope and denounce the papacy, and that's going to lead to a major break known as the Protestant Reformation. The Catholic Church is going to counter with the Counter-Reformation, which we're going to study a little bit later. It's not quite in the bounds of the Renaissance. It follows more in that Baroque period that follows. But just worth noting to keep up with all of the different religious changes that are happening at this moment in time, because they really do influence every other facet of the Renaissance. So, as I mentioned on the last slide, Martin Luther plays a critical role in the destabilization of the Catholic Church. So Martin Luther was a German professor of theology. He was a priest and author and a composer. But most importantly, Luther played a crucial role in the Protestant Reformation. Luther proposed an academic discussion of the practice of indulgence, which is basically just determining how much punishment is worthy of each sin, how can you exonerate that, all of that within the Catholic Church. And he denounced these practices and argued for reform in his 95 Theses. So that's going to be his major work. It sends rifts throughout the Catholic Church. And ultimately, these views would cause his demise as Pope Leo X wanted Martin Luther to renounce all of his writings, and Luther's refusal to do so eventually led to his excommunication. In terms of religious ideas, Luther taught that salvation and eternal life are not earned by good deeds, but are received as the free gift of God's grace through Jesus Christ. This theology challenged papal authority and became a major tenet of Protestantism. He further challenged papal authority by teaching that the Bible is the only source of divinely revealed knowledge. So the Pope did not have the ability to add on to that divinely revealed knowledge. And then lastly, he also made the Bible more accessible by translating it into German so that even laypersons could understand its teachings. While he is an important figure in our historical timeline, I do feel that it is also important to note that he was a flawed figure. In some of his later works, Luther expressed antagonistic views and violent views towards Jews, advocating that synagogues should be burned and Jews should be killed. He expressed similar views towards Roman Catholics, so Like I said, while he is a major figure in our timeline, and he did contribute a lot of good to the way that Christianity is taught and perceived, he was by no means a perfect figure. He did have his flaws as well. Um, and then, just as another note, he was married. And viewed marriage as a means of finding a companion rather than just trying to build a family. So, continuing our discussion of religion, just a couple of things left to touch on. The emphasis shifts from spirituality, which was incredibly important, to more humane things. So, how can we live our religion in our everyday life? Obviously, it was still very, very important to them to be spiritual, especially as the Catholic Church was trying to maintain its grasp on most of Europe. But you do see a lot more of those humane aspects coming into play. So during the Gothic period, the church had frowned upon the classics and those ancient cultures, mostly because it had been lost and degraded by that point. And we're going to see a lot of rediscovery within the Renaissance, but also because those cultures worshipped the gods of mythology, so they wanted to clear that out and not give Christians any alternative forms of worship. So they wanted to pretty much eradicate any other religion that was present during the Gothic time period, and we see a little bit of, like I said, during the Renaissance, the church is losing a little bit of that power. So we're going to see people studying the humanities and looking back on those ancient cultures. And while we'll never really see the Greek or Roman religions picked up again in their full extent, we are going to see them influence culture in many ways. So now we're going to look at what the Renaissance is perhaps most known for outside of those scientific advances. We're going to look at the artistic side of the Renaissance. So, this is going to reach a new height in what we perceive as art. So, this is going to be a true revival of all of those amazing, amazing feats that we saw during the classical time periods. So, all of these elements that had previously been lost, and we'll go over them a little bit when we actually see images of the art. It's a little bit hard to explain some of these terms without that, but you see a big revival of foreshortening and perspective, which had been almost completely lost throughout the Middle Ages, and these are those elements that make your paintings look so realistic. Furthermore, every Italian was a judge of art, so art was a big part of their everyday lives. Everyone would have interacted with it at some point in their day, which made it so critically important to them. They invested in it. They took the time to make sure that their masters learned it properly. This is really one of the first times that we see the foundation of workshops and guilds to teach artists the proper way to paint things and the proper way to build things. And all artists were taught how to draw first. It's actually the methods of teaching from the Renaissance that we use in art classrooms today. So all of that foundation is laid during the Renaissance, which is why it's so critically important to our understanding of art from this point out. Time was no factor in creating a masterpiece. These things could take decades. And benefactors often cared for the artist. Artists often lived in the homes of people who were commissioning their works. They were paid very well. Like I said, there was a very high reverence for this. And then artists also worked with several different subjects, everything from philosophy to poetry to music to painting to sculpture. They would have depicted this within their artwork. They would have practiced each of that artwork or each of those art forms. So like Michelangelo, who we know for painting the Sistine Chapel and working in sculpture, he was also a musician. He wrote poetry. He did everything that being an artist could possibly mean, he participated in that, and that was not uncommon for the artist of the Renaissance. And then, as I mentioned before, it's a revival of classical arts and architecture. So, one thing that's not on this slide that I want you to just jot down in your notes really quickly is we know so much about the lives of these artists. While it's not a perfectly clear picture of it, Giorgio Vasari was going through at this time period and interacting with the artist and with the works that the artist were making, and we regard him as the first art historian. So he wrote about the lives of the artists of the Renaissance, everyone from Da Vinci to Michelangelo. And so, because of that, we have a lot of firsthand documentation over what creating these pieces would have taken. So, we know every little aspect of who commissioned what and what that was commissioned for, and how the artist built it, and the creative thought process behind that. And a lot of our knowledge of that can be credited to Giorgio Vasari, spelled sorry for my writing here, Sari, Vasari. There were lots of philosophical advancements as well. So, just as we saw in the Greek society, there is a heavy emphasis on individualism during the Renaissance. So, each person was able to develop their own school of thought, and this was heavily celebrated. You wanted each person to be recognized as an individual rather than as a cog in a collective society. Genealogy and class became less important, but don't get me wrong, they were definitely still important. However, if you were intelligent enough, it didn't really matter what caste you were born into, you would be able to rise above that to some degree. Women were also somewhat emancipated, so I don't want this to come across as though they had equal rights. That could not be further from the truth, but they did have a little bit more freedom. You do get to see them somewhat in that art realm, and get to practice some of the same things that men get to practice, though they definitely still did not have the same or equal rights as men did at this time. The times were more peaceful, and peace was generally encouraged during this time period, so there was a bit more time for refinement. So you had nice dresses, manners, table manners became much more important. You had high interest in reading and music and literature and opera. Classical ballet would become quite popular. So all of those really artistic elements, we're going to see those elevated time and time again during the Renaissance. So this is another of Leonardo's sketches, but this one is of a Vitruvian man. So if you'll recall back to those ancient Greek days, Vitruvius was very concerned with proportions and how different pieces fit together, right? And so in this image, you can see that the man fits perfectly within the confines of the square as well as within the circle. So proportionally, those fit Vitruvius's ideal dimensions. So some final notes on the philosophic ideas of the Renaissance. It's important to note that they were able to make a lot of these advancements because life became a lot calmer. So we finally see the end of the Crusades, which leads to a lot more peace within the area. And then religious fervor died down. So the Catholic Church, like I said, it's going to lose a lot of its grip over society during this time, but that allowed for a lot of individual and scientific growth. You also have fewer invasions, so cities felt more comfortable expanding beyond the protective walls that they had put in place. Remember, during the Middle Ages, those were so necessary that they added those crenellations to the top, so that you could actually defend yourself from your city walls. That's not going to be as necessary anymore because those invasions are going to become fewer and far between. You also see people planning for a more permanent home. So as stability increases, people want their lifestyle to last their whole life and even beyond them in many areas. So you're going to see a lot of very extensive homes that are more permanent than the ones we had looked at in the past. Politically, we are still going to be seeing a version of the feudal system, though probably not as severe as what we had seen before. Generally, there were ruling wealthy families in each city. Sometimes this was good, sometimes it was bad, so they often rivaled each other with their palaces and their villas. So think of it more as cold warring instead of hot warring. There's not necessarily as much fighting, but there's definitely a lot of feuding going on between the states. However, this was good with the amount of wealth that they attained because it did allow them to be amazing patrons of the arts. They funded amazing art projects that we wouldn't have if they weren't as wealthy as they were. And yes, they relied on a lot of people being peasants in order to maintain their wealth. So I'm not here to say that it was great for everybody, but the inequality also allows us to have a lot of the art that we have today. So a bit of beauty coming from some inequality. When we talk about the Renaissance, we generally break it down into 4 main time periods: the Quattrocento, the Quinquecento, the Baroque and Rococo periods, and the period of foreign influences. So in that first one, the Quattrocento, from 1400 to 1500, we see a lot of major developments. So first, we're going to notice that Constantinople falls in 1453, and a lot of the Roman scholars that were in Constantinople return to Rome. So they bring all of that knowledge back to Italy from modern-day Turkey. In the Quinquecento period, from 1500 to 1600, we have what's known as the High Renaissance. And this is going to be that period where we see Raphael and Michelangelo and a lot of those really famous artists of the Renaissance reaching what we believe to be the peak of the Renaissance. That's where we're going to see the highest form of classical revival happening. And then we're going to have the Baroque and Rococo periods, which come immediately after that High Renaissance, in between 1600 to 1755. They are going to ditch those orders, so we're not going to see that same influence of the Greek styles that we saw from classical antiquity. It's actually going to be done in a whole new way, but the Baroque style is still very unique and interesting, and so it has a lot of original thought behind it. And then lastly, we see a period of foreign influences. So the Italians had dominated the art world for centuries at this point, but we're finally going to see some different artists coming out of other areas of the world, specifically the Netherlands, as well as France and Spain, are going to have their own real rise in art talent. So the Quattrocento really captures the idea of a classical revival. So this is going to bring back all of those Greek and Roman orders that we've seen before, specifically in their architecture is one of the main ways that we distinctively know the difference between the Gothic period and the classical revival. Because their art, a lot of that's going to have a little bit of overlap. It will become much more sophisticated using those foreshortening techniques that we've seen before. But the architecture is one of the biggest ways in which we can tell that there was a return to those classical styles. So Palladio and Vignola revived the classical orders, and they also used the Palladian arch as well as the Vitruvian orders. We will also see a Florentine arch, which is unique to the area around Florence. The recipe for concrete was found again, so they were able to use both stone and concrete in their construction. And they also used corrugated tile roofs, which we saw in Pompeii. Domestic architecture was important. Remember that we have that fight back against the church's authority at this point. So we see a lot of palaces and villas being built rather than just your usual churches, which were really emphasized in these other periods before the Renaissance, where we were mostly only seeing religious architecture. That's going to be the opposite here. There's going to be a lot more emphasis on palaces and villas. So on this slide, you see an image of the baptistry in Florence. And you can see here a clear indication of the Florentine arch, as well as some of the return of those classical elements. So you see the Corinthian columns here, so definitely falls within that Corinthian order, except for the use of the Florentine arch, which we wouldn't have seen in Greece. But you still have that architrave molding, the pediments, as well as an entablature. So just some quick background on the Florence baptistry. It's dedicated to Saint John, who is the patron saint of Florence, and the baptistry is one of the oldest buildings in the city, constructed between 1059 and 1158 in the Florentine Romanesque style. The baptistry is renowned for its 3 sets of artistically important bronze doors with relief sculptures. On their own, these doors have a quite extensive history, which we're not going to get into right now. But the south doors were created by Andrea Pisano, and the east doors were designed by Lorenzo Ghiberti. Michelangelo named the east doors the Gates of Paradise, and Giorgio Vasari commented that these doors were undeniably perfect in every way and must rank as the finest masterpiece ever created. There are 10 panels on these doors that depict scenes from the Old Testament. So as I mentioned earlier, just a casual reminder, we also see the use of the Florentine arch, as well as a revival of classical elements such as the architrave moldings, pediments, uniformed orders, and the entablature. So this is a palace exterior, and it should remind you a lot of those Greek orders, as it definitely fits within those lines. So you can see your pediment, your entablature, as well as, once again, those Corinthian columns. So they are still valuing those really detailed pieces, but they're doing it in a very classical way, down to the dentils and the use of marble statues. Okay, so on this slide, you see an image of the Florentine arch with medallions, and just to give you a really brief overview of what the Florentine arch is, it does have that double semicircle look, but what makes it important is that this area here, at the top, there's going to be a greater distance between those semicircles than there is at the sides. So that radius is actually different. This one would be more of an oval, technically, by the time it's done, whereas this one is a true semicircle. So this image here is of the Palazzo Venezia in Rome, and as you can tell, there are a lot of Greek elements that you can see here from that colonnade and arcade, down to the metapiece and triglyphs. You've got the dentils, the pediments, and all of those orders are still being used here. So I believe these are done either in the Corinthian or Ionic. I'm not going to lie, I can't tell from this image just because it's not zoomed in enough. But as you can tell, it's definitely done in the Greek Revival style. So on this slide, you see an image of the Farnese Palace, also known as the Palazzo Farnese. And this is a Roman palace that serves as an important example of high Renaissance architecture. It was designed by Antonio da Sangallo the Younger and built between 1517 and 1589. In 1546, when Sangallo died, leaving the building of the palace unfinished, Michelangelo was appointed by Pope Paul III, who was a member of the Farnese family, to complete the work. Michelangelo is responsible for the balcony, the large coat of arms, the windows of the upper story, and the cornice of the main facade, as well as the upper story of the cortile, or the main courtyard, which is more Mannerist than High Renaissance in style. The interior is decorated with frescoes by Annibale Carracci, and the palace now houses the French embassy. This building here is the Uffizi in Florence, and this was commissioned by Cosimo de' Medici, who instructed Giorgio Vasari to design this building. So in construction with Cosimo's sculptural commissions, he also ordered the building of the Uffizi, designed to house all of the civil offices, the guilds, and the Medici court artist. The Uffizi is an architectural symbol of a unified bureaucracy under Medici rule. Giorgio Vasari, the architect of the complex and the impresario of Cosimo's most important artistic commissions after 1555, built a long U-shaped building whose colonnades at the ground level imitate those in the Roman Forum. This reference to imperial rule was made explicit using Dante's statue of Cosimo as Augustus in a niche in the cross arm of the building. The statue, showing the emperor in a military costume, was appropriate for Cosimo I, whose reputation as a military leader was well understood. Although the appropriateness of such an image within this civic context might be questioned, the Arno, flowing west to Pisa, which Cosimo had taken for Florence, could be seen through the open archway at the end of the axis of the building. Dante had studied with Michelangelo and Daniele da Volterra in Rome before coming to Florence in 1557, and thus he knew both the traditions of the ancient military statues of emperors and the conventions of twisting body poses and fantastical armor that were part of the contemporary artistic vocabulary. Vasari ordered the difficult site by dividing the facades into tripariate bays, in which triangular and segmented pediments alternate over the windows in an A-B-A pattern, and breaking and extending the cornice lines forward at the separation of each bay. Nonetheless, the unremitting repetition of forms set up a sense of oppressive order in the urban landscape, which could be related to Cosimo's control over the state. As an extension of the Piazza del Signoria, and with its virtual attachment to the Palazzo della Signoria and the Loggia della Signoria, the Uffizi marks the imposition of Cosimo's ducal government over all aspects, political, mercantile, and artistic, of civil life. So this is the Villa La Rotonda. It was made by the architect Palladio, and this was begun in 1550. And it's in Vicenza, so that's a little bit outside of the Venice area. And the patron for this building is a Cardinal Almerico, and this is where he wants to spend his free time. So, this is known as La Rotonda, and it differs from other countryside residences in that it was built primarily as a suburban retreat rather than as a working farm. As was the case with all of Palladio's villas, the exterior is rather plain. The setting made it grand and inspired Palladio to give each side of the house, built on a centralized plan, a pedimented loggia, as to enjoy, in the architect's words, beautiful views on every side, some of which are limited, others more distant, and still others that reach the horizon. Each portico is approached by a broad staircase. These extremely sensitive deployment of simple forms, square, rectangle, and triangle, combined with Palladio's unerring sense of proportion, culminates in a shallow dome which forms a surrogate crest to the hill, uniting the building and the land upon which it rests. Passageways originally interrupted the center of each of the building's 4 exterior staircases to allow carts easy access to the ground floor work areas, which contained internal staircases leading to an attic granary. The building's main floor was designed for gracious and luxurious entertaining, with symmetrically disposed rectangular reception rooms encircling a domed central hall. So, as I mentioned, the site here is really dramatic. It's on a hilltop with agriculture all around it. Produce was pretty difficult in Venice. It had to be imported in from these suburban areas. And then it's also paying homage to the ancient villa, but in a very idealized way. So the circular temple is ideal. And as you can see here, this villa, if you took the circle that dome on the top creates, it's going to fit perfectly if you keep extending it perfectly within the square below it. So that should recall the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo. And then it's also located on higher ground, so it gets a breeze and is out of the bad air that people believed was making them sick. In reality, this probably brought it away from marshes, which carried mosquitoes, and malaria was a really popular disease at the time. So that's probably what made them feel better when they were actually up here at this space. This type of pediment was intended by the Greeks to only be used on a temple in antiquity, but as we can tell here, they're reinterpreting that and reevaluating what should be used where and allowing this to be used on a villa rather than on a temple. And this building has been rather influential, so we're actually going to be able to see some of this influence when we look at the American styles later on in this course, as this is the building that Thomas Jefferson's home will be modeled after. And these are just some additional pictures of that Villa La Rotonda so that you can see that it looks the same on each side. Here you can see an image and drawing of a Palladian arch, so as you can tell, it's just part of a grouping of 3, and this was something that Palladio used in a lot of his designs, which is why we credit him with this specific style of arch. This is another Renaissance building. This one is actually outside of Italy. This one's up in London, and this is the Chiswick House. And as you can tell, there is still the use, it's not as ornamented or as decorated as what we have seen in the past couple of slides, but you can tell it does have that same triangular pediment as well as the use of the columns. So it's very much in the Greek Revival style, despite the fact that it is all the way up in London. So grottos were also important within the Renaissance, and these are a natural or artificial cave that was often used for religious artifacts, chapels, baths, or garden features. And St. John wrote the Book of Revelations in a grotto in the Isle of Patmos. So this is just an up-close image of one of those grottos. You can see it would have housed all of those religious artifacts while still being surrounded by nature. Just because these grottos were built into nature doesn't mean they wouldn't have had elaborate decoration outside. So you can see one of these parterre gardens, as well as these elaborate staircases leading to the grotto entrance at the Villa Torrigiani. So now that we've spent some time on the architecture and history of the Renaissance, we're going to move on to the interiors. So everything was done in a really large scale, and walls often were made of plaster and featured frescoes. To add some extra decoration, they also used niches with some sculpture as well as tapestries. Fireplaces became quite common, and there was a very small hood or no hood at all, though the mantle still would have been great for decoration, and they would have decorated these with classical details. Ceilings often featured hammer beam ceilings with brackets, plasterwork, or coffered ceilings, And we also see the revival of some flat ceilings during this time period. The floors were often made of marble tile or brick, and they often featured some type of parquet as well, though they could also be made out of terrazzo, which is like almost a concrete but a little bit more fancy. And then they could also use small rugs. So instead of just walking on the bare floor, they would have put down those carpets to make it a little bit more comfortable. The doors and windows were often deep, so they had a lot of space where that jamb would have to be. And then they often used arches, and then they also really heavily favored the architrave molding above each of those doors and windows. The colors were often rich, dark, and intense, and we'll see this in the interiors, but also within the art. And remember, the art and interiors here are going to overlap a lot because they do so heavily focus on frescoes. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, the art and the interior design often overlap in the Renaissance time period, and part of that is because interior design really begins to emphasize the home. So, the home is no longer just for strength, protection, and safety, but it's also for comfort, convenience, and beauty. So, they wanted these spaces that you could live in that were dramatic and rich and felt fulfilling to be inside of, and so that's why they had such a great time decorating all of these spaces. Everything's heavily ornamented, everything's thought out and well planned. So this is an interior of a palace, and as you can see, the walls are covered with frescoes, which would have had all sorts of different religious and philosophical meanings to them. You can also see the coffered ceiling, so each of these little squares here is a coffer. As well as that fireplace, which you can see here. It does have a pretty small hood, though it is highly decorated, and you can see the use of the architectural orders here. You can also see all of this here. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this palace interior here is part of the Villa Farnese, and all of this out here where you can see these columns and this landscape that was back behind it, this actually wouldn't have been a part of their room. That's not real. That is a fresco that is painted to look like you're overlooking a natural landscape, despite the fact that you would have had a cityscape beyond that wall. So that's all the art of illusion. You can also tell kind of when you look at the floor here that these columns that look like they are engaged are actually just painted onto the wall. They're not protruding at all from the wall, but they're actually done as an optical illusion by the artist of this space. So on this slide, you can see an up-close image of one of those fireplaces, not in the last building that we looked at, but just a general one. And you can see that it has the plastered wall, the hooded fireplace, so the hood is quite small. It also makes use of brackets as well as a classical frieze. So if you'll remember, the frieze is this area here. We also see the use of medallions and classical figures. And then down here in the corner, we see a Savonarola chair. This is another villa interior, and you can tell that it does have those plastered walls that aren't necessarily covered with frescoes, but you can still see a lot of that high Renaissance art featured in the space. You also see the medallions, and you've got a nice fireplace right here. Most of the furniture in the Renaissance was made out of wood, 90% of which would have been walnut and the other 10% of which would have been oak. And we see a lot of different styles becoming popular. Remember, the Renaissance lasted for a while, so it's not rare that we would see all of these different things become popular over time. Trends change. But we also see a lot of that coming back and being very much influenced by the antiquity styles. So we have the sedia chair, which is rectilinear and features some upholstery. The scabello chair, which is a trestle base, so it's almost more of a stool with a chair back added to it. the Savonarola, which has the crewel base, as well as rails, and a Certosina. And we'll go over all of these in a minute, so don't worry if it's not clicking quite yet. The Dante features the crewel base with upholstery. The monastery, which just looks like a folding chair. We also have the cassone and the casapanca, as well as refectory tables. Now, if you'll remember, the refectory is where the monks would eat at a monastery, so they're going to have those trestles, columns, and baluster legs. And then we're also going to see a letto, which is a large bed. So this image here is of those Scabello chairs, so you can see the base like I was talking about. It almost looks like a pedestal with a back attached to it. And here's an image of one of those monastery chairs, so you can tell that it could have been easily folded up, which would have been nice with so many people living in one space to have that flexibility of movable furniture. So these were easy to carry, lightweight. I can't imagine that they would have been the most comfortable, but they definitely served their purpose. So here you can see the Savonarola chairs. So this is the crewel base. It's that X form that was pretty popular during the Greek and Roman period. However, you can tell that these would have been much more highly decorated with that back being carved, as well as having, oh, those are cute little dogs. But just the different various levels of decoration that was been added to this, despite the fact that it is a very basic form. So it's just, like I said, that X shape, what we call the crewel base, as well as having those added arms and the nice back. This is the Dante chair, which would have once again made use of that crewel base, that X style base, except this would have been upholstered. So it probably would have been a little bit more comfortable than that last chair that we looked at, and a little bit more delicate. So a lot of these that we currently have for display have obviously had to be reupholstered as the wood has lasted, but the upholstery has not. So this here, this bottom image, is a cassone, and it serves the same role that a chest would. We'll look at one in more detail on the next slide, but these would have been highly decorated with different pieces of art, carvings, and there's numerous things that it could have depicted. Oftentimes it was something to do with either antiquity or with the church. So, like I said, heavily decorated, but serving the purpose of a chest. So this is another image of a cassone. As you can tell here, it features a battle scene, and you can see where it opens. So this area here, and I believe this is a modern recreation, but you can still tell that it has that added area for storage, but it could also be sat on like a bench if need be. So this is just one more image of that cassone. You can tell that this one is much more fanciful, but it still has those depictions of, I believe once again, this is some type of battle scene or some recall to the antiquity carvings that would have been popular during the Greek and Roman time periods. But you can see all of that use of the different types of moldings on here as well, which make it incredibly interesting to look at. This is a casapanca, which is basically just a bench. This one is highly decorated here, so you can see all of these. I don't believe this one is actually from the Renaissance itself, just based on what I can see from some of these other elements. They look a little bit more English to me. But this style and shape would have been very popular. It serves, like I said, as a bench, as a sofa almost. So this is also where we get the shape for most of our church pews that we see today. If you recognize this shape, that's where this is from. So this is an image of a trestle table, and the trestle is this part that I am tracing now. Sometimes it could be much more simplified than this. Sometimes it was just as ornate as this. And this trestle would be repeated on both ends, and there would be a stretcher in between. So another type of leg base that was quite popular is going to be this column leg. So it would have followed within the bounds of those architectural orders. So as I've mentioned throughout this course, oftentimes the decorative elements follow the style of the architecture, and it's no different during the Renaissance. So we see a lot of those architectural elements repeated in the furniture. So those columns being on the table base is not rare, and it's actually quite popular throughout the Renaissance and previously and following. So a new type of ornament called the gadroon is here. And it's actually going to be this little piece that's inverted. So it's a style of inverting the fluting. So that fluting that we would see on the columns coming outward now, and being done towards the outside rather than being concave towards the inside, that's going to be what that gadroon is. So once again, we have another style of leg here. This is a baluster leg. It looks a lot like your standard stair baluster, so that's how you should be able to remember that one. And then you also see a credenza with a full entablature here. So that's going to be what this piece is. And as you can tell, it serves the purpose of being a full entablature. You have that top piece of molding, that bottom piece of molding, and the entablature in between. This is another credence, but this one has a full entablature and caryatid shaft. So remember, the caryatids were the columns that were made using female statues. So you can see one of those statues right here. So this is a review sheet. Feel free to screenshot it so that you can look at it up close. But you'll be able to see, like, here's that Dante chair. Sorry, I need to get my pen ready. Here's that Dante chair. You've got the Savonarola chair, the Scabello. So all of those different elements you can see here. So it would be pretty helpful for you to review these materials when you're getting ready for your test. So we're going to move on to ornament, but I promise you we're not going to spend a long time on all of this, mostly because 99% of this you're going to have seen before. That's why we spent so long on those ancient societies and their ideas of decoration, because all of it's going to be repeated here. You're going to know most of these terms, and if you don't, they should all be in your vocabulary list. So please feel free to email us if you have any questions about any of this, but like I said, I'm not going to spend too long on it because most of these elements you've seen before. So you have those arabesque elements, as well as the chartreuse. You do see a certosina, and a certosina is basically an inlay of small pieces of wood, bone, metal, or mother of pearl, and it creates geometric patterns on wood. You also have those pediments, the marquetry, which is basically parquetry, but on furniture rather than on the floor. So those parquet floors, which kind of look like either a herringbone pattern, sometimes they're in a crisscross, the different patterns made out of wood. That's what a parquet floor is. You also see the niches and finials, as well as the intaglio, which is the countersunk style. You see a lot of pilasters and gilding. So the pilasters, if you'll remember, those are the square columns that are engaged to the wall. You see a lot of medallions. Arches are still quite popular, whether they are triangular, segmental, semicircular, or broken. No matter how you see those, they're definitely still very popular in this period. We also see the atlas and caryatid figures, as well as vases and the acanthus leaves. So like I said, most all of these you have seen before, but feel free to look all of these up. They should be in the attached vocabulary sheet for you if you need any help going over any of these. So these are some more forms of ornament. You have that Bolecton molding, as well as polychroming, though not to the extent that we saw in Greece. You will still see some polychroming here. You will also see some pietratura, which is just a mosaic pattern, as well as the painters and vivantes, which are 3D religious figures. Nail heads were also quite popular, as well as fringe and medallions to decorate furniture specifically, but also draperies and other art forms. You see majolica, which is enamelware, and this was often seen in bright colors. We also see a rise in prominence of Della Robbia's lace, glass, and mirror work. So once again, this is just another review sheet that has a lot of those furniture and architectural forms on it. So you see the Florentine arch here, the marble mantle, and this is a hooded mantle, so you can see that hood to it. And then you see a table with baluster legs and a credenza. So just make sure you're going over all of these forms. I know towards the end we tried to get through it a little bit more quickly, so I'm sorry if any of that felt rushed. But unfortunately for you, but fortunately because we get to learn a lot of really fun stuff, we do still have a ways to go in this lecture, but this would be the best time for you to pause it because we're about to get into the art. So that's going to be a bit of a shift. So all of this stuff up until now was mostly based around the architectural and interior elements, but we're going to take a turn to look at those artistic advancements in a moment. So if you want to take a break, this would be a great time to do so. Alright, so if you decided to hit pause, welcome back. We're now going to start looking into the art of the Italian Renaissance. While I personally prefer modern art myself, there are some amazingly incredible pieces to come out of the Renaissance that are still heavily influential today. And we'll also see a lot of those interior and architectural elements that we just talked about become pretty present in each of these pieces of art. So this is a repeat of a slide that you actually saw earlier, but I just want to go over these things one more time. So you have the artistic advancements of foreshortening and perspective. So both of these allow for a recession into space, which makes things seem much more realistic than if everything were on the same flat visual plane. And then, as I talked about earlier, every Italian believed themselves to be a judge of art. It was something that they interacted with quite often in their daily lives, whether that be through the church or in their civic spaces. Everyone would have interacted with these visuals in some way or another. Therefore, they felt uniquely qualified to judge and determine which pieces of art were good versus which pieces of art were bad. Time was no factor in creating these masterpieces. Artists would work for decades, usually just many years, but sometimes even decades on projects. And they would do so with the help of benefactors who cared for the artist and paid for them to continue to work. And then artists also worked in several mediums such as philosophy, poetry, music, painting, and sculpture. So any type of art that we consider to be art today, they would have been really well-rounded and likely participated in each of those. And then we also see the revival of classical arts and architecture. So the first artist that we're going to look at today is Leonardo da Vinci, and he was born in April of 1452 in Vinci, Italy, which is part of the Republic of Florence at this point in time. And he would die in France in May of 1519 at the age of 67. So for someone in the Renaissance, this was actually a fairly long life. And Leonardo really embodied every aspect of what a Renaissance artist was supposed to be. Not only was he a painter, but he also was a sculptor, an architect, and an engineer. And we know him for some of his most famous works, though We don't have very many surviving works of his, but we do have arguably the most famous painting in the world, the Mona Lisa, as well as the Last Supper, which is actually located up in Milan. Um, and that would have been done under the service of Ludovico Sforza, who was the Duke of Milan and Leonardo's patron. So he often worked with Ludovico Sforza, and that was who commissioned most of his later works. And this is done in a monastery refectory. Um, and then lastly, he believed that man is the measure of all things. So that was actually one of his writings. And it basically just encompasses the idea that man is the master of his thoughts, not the church. Despite the fact that many of his paintings are religious in some capacity, Leonardo wasn't a particularly religious person, but rather just painting what he was commissioned to paint, though he still definitely added his own touch to that. And then he often used a compass, which was a new mechanical tool at the time, and believed that artists were a measure of many things and that they should be multi-talented. So on this slide, you can see an image of the Mona Lisa, which was painted by Leonardo da Vinci in the early 1500s, though the dates are actually a little bit unclear. This is currently on view at the Louvre in Paris, and it is likely the most visited painting in the world, with 80% of visitors citing this work as being their primary reason for visiting the Louvre. So one of Leonardo's greatest accomplishments as a painter was his transformation of the portrait from an icon of status to the representation of a person fully engaged with the viewer, something that he had begun with his portrait of Guinevere de' Benci before his move to Milan. His Mona Lisa, showing an unidentified woman seated against the background of a rocky, watery landscape, epitomizes this achievement, based in part on contemporary developments in Venetian painting, which Leonardo would have seen when he visited that city in 1500 on his way to Florence after having fled Milan. Her crossed arms form the base of a triangle, with her head as its apex. Her face is an idealized oval, emphasized by the sharp semicircular delineation between the crown of her head and the sky behind. The contours of her face, hands, and body are rendered with the utmost sensitivity, so that the convex merges into the concave in a continuous movement. Leonardo's use of the sfumato technique, at least as it can be currently understood from this quite dirty painting, blends light and dark and one form with another to enhance the unity of the composition. The lady turns gently to recognize the presence of the viewer, her slight smile the subject of endless speculation, inviting conversation. Unlike many portraits of women during this period, Mona Lisa is represented without any of the normal attributes of wealth. She wears no rings or other jewelry, although her dress seems to be made of fine materials. Her hair hangs loose, and a scarf seems casually thrown over her left shoulder, adding an unusual air of informality to the picture. These anomalies, tied to contemporary accounts indicating that Leonardo worked on the painting while he was in Rome after 1513, suggest that, like many of the artist's other paintings, the Mona Lisa had a long history. Whatever painting Leonardo may have begun in Florence, he may well have modified it at a later date so that it became much more than a portrait. It seems to be a meditation of ideal feminine beauty and an exploration of the sitter's psyche. The rivers, streams, and mist-covered mountains in the background and careful alignment of the sitter's eyes with the horizon mark her as fully part of a larger universe. This is an image of Leonardo's Last Supper, which was painted in 1498, it is tempera and oil on plaster, and it is located in the Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, Italy. The subject of the Last Supper is Christ's final meal with his apostle before Judas identifies Christ to the authorities who arrest him. The Last Supper is remembered for two events. Christ says to his apostles, "One of you will betray me," and the apostles react, each according to his own personality. Referring to the Gospels, Leonardo depicts Philip asking, "Lord, is it I?" And Christ replies, "He that dippeth his hand with me in the dish, the same shall betray me." We see Christ and Judas simultaneously reaching towards a plate that lies between them, even as Judas defensively backs away. Leonardo also simultaneously depicts Christ blessing the bread and saying to the apostles, "Take, eat, this is my body," and blessing the wine, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for the forgiveness of sins," in Matthew 26. These words are the founding moment of the sacrament of the Eucharist. Leonardo's Last Supper is dense with symbolic references. Attributes identify each apostle. For example, Judas is recognized both as he reaches towards a plate beside Christ and because he clutches a purse containing his reward for identifying Christ to the authorities the following day. Peter, who sits beside Judas, holds a knife in his right hand, foreshadowing that Peter will sever the ear of a soldier as he attempts to protect Christ from arrest. The balanced composition is anchored by equilateral triangle formed by Christ's body. He sits below an arching pediment that, if completed, traces a circle. These ideal geometric forms refer to the Renaissance interest in Neoplatonism, which is an element of the humanist revival that reconciles aspects of Greek philosophy with Christian theology. In his allegory, The Cave, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato emphasized the imperfection of the earthly realm. Geometry, used by the Greeks to express heavenly perfection, has been used by Leonardo to celebrate Christ as the embodiment of heaven on earth. Leonardo rendered a verdant landscape beyond the windows. Often interpreted as paradise, it has been suggested that this heavenly sanctuary can only be reached through Christ. The 12 apostles are arranged as 4 groups of 3, and there are also 3 windows. The number 3 is often a reference to the Holy Trinity in Catholic art. In contrast, the number 4 is important in the classical tradition due to Plato's 4 virtues. The Last Supper is in terrible condition. Soon after the painting was completed, on February 9, 1498, it began to deteriorate. By the second half of the 16th century, Giovanni Paolo Lamazzo stated that the painting is all ruined. Over the past 500 years, the painting's condition has been seriously compromised by its location, the materials and techniques used, humidity, dust, and poor restoration efforts. Modern problems have included a bomb that hit the monastery, destroying a large section of the refectory on August 16, 1943, severe air pollution in post-war Milan, and finally, the effects of crowding tourists. Because Leonardo sought a greater detail and luminosity than could be achieved with traditional fresco, he covered the wall with a double layer of dried plaster. Then, borrowing from the panel painting, he added an undercoat of lead white to enhance the brightness of the oil and tempera that was applied on top. The experimental technique allowed for chromatic brilliance and extraordinary precision, but because the painting is on a thin exterior wall, the effects of humidity were felt more keenly, and the paint failed to properly adhere to the wall. There have been 7 documented attempts to repair the Last Supper. The first restoration took place in 1726, and the last and most extensive was completed in 1999. Instead of attempting to restore the image, the last conservation effort sought to arrest further deterioration and, where possible, uncover Leonardo's original painting. Begun in 1977 and comprising of more than 12,000 hours of structural work and 38,000 hours of work on the painting itself, this effort has resulted in an image where approximately 42.5% of the surface is Leonardo's work, 17.5% is lost, and the remaining 40% are additions of previous restorers. Most of the painting is found in the wall hangings and ceilings. So we discussed this drawing a little bit earlier, but this is a drawing of Vitruvius text from De Arctura, and this was done by Leonardo da Vinci, and it was intended to be a clear connection to the ancient Greeks. This places the human figure in the center of a perfectly ordered universe, which was what the Greeks as well as the Romans would actually hope for. So this is just once again another example of a clear connection to the revival of ancient styles. So the next artist that we're going to look at is Michelangelo, and he was born in 1475 and lived until 1564. So once again, another long life. This would have been quite an anomaly at the time. Most people weren't really living beyond 50. So the fact that he made it almost 90 years is quite impressive. Michelangelo was a painter, sculptor, architect, and poet, widely considered one of the most brilliant artists of the Italian Renaissance. He was an apprentice to a painter before studying in the sculpture gardens of the powerful Medici family in Florence. What followed was a remarkable career as an artist, famed in his own time for his artistic virtuosity. Although he always considered himself a Florentine, Michelangelo lived most of his life in Rome, where he died at the age of 88. So he actually starts his work really young. The first work that we attribute to him is the Battle of the Centaurs at age 17. But some of his most famous works include the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the Last Judgment, which is also on that Sistine Chapel wall, the Dome of St. Peter's, that's one of his great architectural feats, as well as the David, which he made when he was only 27 years old. And then he also made sculptures of Moses, which was part of the tomb for Pope Julius, and then the Pietà, which shows Mary holding the body of Christ before his entombment. This slide shows an image of Michelangelo's Battle of the Centaurs, which was created around 1492 when Michelangelo was only 17 years old. He created it under the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici, who died shortly after its completion. It was inspired by a classical relief created by Giovanni, and the marble sculpture depicts the mythic battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. And this was a popular subject of art in ancient Greece, so once again, going back to those ancient subjects that had been missing for quite some time. And then the Battle of Centaurs was a remarkable sculpture in several ways, and it gives a preview of Michelangelo's future sculptural direction. So Michelangelo had departed from the then current practices of working on a discrete plane to working multi-dimensionally. So that just means that it goes in multiple directions rather than having one specific plane that you're carving into. And then this was also the first sculpture Michelangelo created without the use of a bow drill, and the first sculpture to reach such a state of completion with the marks of the chisel left to stand on the final surface. So generally he would try to smooth it out, but we do see some of those rudimentary elements of the chisel up in these corners and edges. So whether intentionally left unfinished or not, the work is significant in the tradition of non finito sculpting technique because it was left unfinished. So Michelangelo regarded it as the best of his early works and a visual reminder of why he should have focused his efforts on sculpture rather than painting. So on this slide, you can see an image of the Sistine Chapel, which is located in the Vatican City, which is in Rome. And this is the private chapel for the Pope. And all of these paintings were done by Michelangelo. It is likely that he wasn't working alone, despite the common misconception that he was. He did have a workshop of people working with him, so while he did design everything himself, he was not by any means the only hand painting this. And we'll go over the different aspects of this on the next few slides, but just to give you a brief overview, this was done in the early 1500s, the ceiling specifically from 1508 to 1512. So to any visitor of Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, two features become immediately and undeniably apparent. One, the ceiling is really high up, and two, there are a lot of paintings up there. Because of this, the centuries have handed down to us an image of Michelangelo laying on his back, wiping sweat and plaster from his eyes as he toiled away year after year, suspended hundreds of feet in the air, begrudgingly completing a commission he never wanted to accept in the first place. Fortunately for Michelangelo, this is probably not true, but that does nothing to lessen the fact that the frescoes, which take up the entirety of the vault, are among the most important paintings in the world. So just to reiterate, Michelangelo did not see himself as a painter, despite the fact that we look at these paintings and consider them to be absolutely stunning and incredible. His heart was in sculpting, and he did not want to be known as a painter. But this was made for Pope Julius II, and Michelangelo began to work on the frescoes for Pope Julius II in 1508, replacing a blue ceiling dotted with stars. Originally, the Pope had asked Michelangelo to paint the ceiling with a geometric ornament and place the 12 apostles in the spandrel around the decoration. Michelangelo proposed instead to paint the Old Testament scenes now found on the vault, divided into the fictive architecture that he uses to organize the composition. And I'll be sure to include on some of these next slides a little map of what you can see here, because it is quite elaborate. But like I said, all of these are images from the Old Testament. We do see some New Testament down around the walls, but everything on the ceiling depicts images from the Old Testament. And one thing to note is that adjustments were made as he was designing this. So he first painted something, I believe, in this corner up here that you can't see, that's supposedly above the Last Judgment, somewhere around that region. He painted it and then got off the scaffolding and realized how small it was, so he actually did have to adjust the design to make each of these pieces larger so that he could showcase things that could actually be seen from the floor, because the ceilings really are incredibly tall. You can tell that this is stacked as like 4 different areas, so 1, 2, 3, 4. And so because of that great height, those numbers of stories, he needed to make sure that everything was detailed but also could clearly be seen from the ground level, as that's where most of the viewers would be standing. So on this slide here, you can see a map of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, and as you can tell, if you walk through it this way, you'll get to see all of those biblical stories played out in order. So you have God dividing the light from the darkness here. Then he creates the sun and planets. He divides the water from the earth, and then he creates Adam. He creates Eve. Adam and Eve are tempted and sent from the Garden of Eden. Then we have Noah and his family make a sacrifice after the flood, the great flood, and Noah is drunk and disgraced. So all of those stories are told in the order that they are told in the New Testament. And one thing that's particularly interesting here is that God creating Adam isn't actually the central panel. It is by far the most popular of each of these 10 panels, but it's not centered within this space. So just an interesting note there. Okay, so now that we have gone over the map, you're actually looking at this flipped. So this is the side of creation. This is that panel of the creation of Adam. And these are those last panels about Noah. So the narrative begins at the altar and is divided into 3 sections. In the first 3 paintings, Michelangelo tells the story of the creation of the heavens and earth. And this is followed by the creation of Adam and Eve and the expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And finally, this is the story of Noah and the Great Flood. So when you look at these, you can also notice a slight stylistic shift. So in 1510, Michelangelo took a year-long break from painting the Sistine Chapel. The frescoes painted after his break are characteristically different from the ones he painted before it and are emblematic of what we think of when we envision the Sistine Chapel paintings. These are the paintings like the creation of Adam, where the narratives have been pared down to only the essential figures depicted on a monumental scale. Because of these changes, Michelangelo is able to convey a strong sense of emotionality that can be perceived from the floor of the chapel. Indeed, the imposing figure of God in the 3 frescoes illustrating the separation of darkness from light and the creation of the heavens and the earth radiates power through his body, and his dramatic gesticulations help to tell the story of Genesis without the addition of extraneous detail. So as I mentioned before he took the break and he hadn't really seen it that well from the ground floor, without all of the scaffolding in the way, it definitely changed the way that he viewed it. So you can tell that some of these are much busier than others, like this is much harder to see, whereas this one here, that creation of Adam, only has the image of Adam and of God, and there are some other figures, don't get me wrong, but the main figures are enlarged in a way that they can easily be understood. So one last thing to note on the Sistine Chapel ceiling as a whole is that the chapel recently underwent a controversial cleaning. So before it was cleaned, everyone assumed that it was a really dull painting, maybe symbolic of some type of darkness. However, when it was cleaned, it brought to light Michelangelo's jewel-like palette, his mastery of chiaroscuro, and addition of iconological details which continue to captivate modern viewers even 500 years after the fresco's original completion. So as you can tell, this is definitely not a bad thing for someone who did not consider themselves to be a painter. He definitely embodied all of the skills that you would want in a painter. His works are still incredibly well known, with such detail and skill and the use of bright colors, which, like I said, many people thought were lackluster until it was cleaned because of all of the soot from the candles that had risen up into the space for so long. So now we get to see a much more clear and full view of what Michelangelo originally wanted us to see, because it is not hidden under layers of dirt and dust and ash. So the most famous section of the Sistine Chapel ceiling is Michelangelo's creation of Adam. This scene is located next to the creation of Eve, which is the panel at the center of the room, and the Congregation of the Waters, which is closer to the altar. The creation of Adam differs from the typical creation scenes painted up until that time. Here, two figures dominate the scene, God on the right and Adam on the left. God is shown inside a floating nebulous form made up of drapery and other figures. The form is supported on angels who fly without wings, but whose flight is made clear by the drapery, which whips out from underneath them. God is depicted as an elderly yet muscular man with gray hair and a long beard, which react to the forward movement of flight. This is a far cry from the imperial images of God that had otherwise been created in the West dating back to the time of late antiquity. Rather than wearing royal garments as depicted as an all-powerful ruler, he wears only a light tunic which leaves much of his arms and legs exposed. One might say this is much more intimate of a portrait of God because he is shown in a state that is not untouchable and remote from man, but one which is accessible to him. Unlike the figure of God, who is outstretched and aloft, Adam is depicted as a lounging figure who rather lackadaisically responds to God's imminent touch. The touch will not only give life to Adam, but will give life to all mankind. It is therefore the birth of the human race. Adam's body forms a concave shape which echoes the form of God's body, which is in a convex posture inside the nebulous floating form. The correspondence of one form to the other seems to underscore the larger idea of man corresponding to God. That is, it seems to reflect the idea that man has been created in the image and likeness of God, an idea at which Michelangelo had to have been familiar. So on this slide, you can see an image of the Last Judgment, which sits on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel and was painted between 1534 and 1541. So this depicts the idea of the second coming, which is a moment that all Christians await with both hope and dread. This is the end of time, the beginning of eternity, when the mortal becomes immortal, when the elect join Christ in his heavenly kingdom and the damned are cast to the unending torments of hell. What a daunting task to visualize the end game of earthly existence, and furthermore to do so in the Sistine Chapel, the private chapel of the papal court, where the leaders of the church gathered to celebrate feast day liturgies, where the Pope's body was laid in state before his funeral, where to this day the College of Cardinals meets to elect the next Pope. No artist in the 16th century Italy was better positioned for this task than Michelangelo, whose completion of the chapel's ceiling in 1512 had sealed his reputation as the greatest master of the human figure, especially the male nude. Pope Paul III was well aware of this when he charged Michelangelo with repainting the chapel's altar wall with the Last Judgment. With its focus on the resurrection of the body, this was the perfect subject for Michelangelo. The Last Judgment was one of the first artworks that Paul III commissioned upon his election to the papacy in 1534. The church he inherited was in crisis. The sack of Rome was still a recent memory. Paul sought to address not only the many abuses that had sparked the Protestant Reformation, but also to affirm the legitimacy of the Catholic Church and the orthodoxy of its doctrines, including the institution of the papacy. The visual arts would play a key role in his agenda, beginning with the message he directed to his inner circle by commissioning the Last Judgment. The decorative program of the Sistine Chapel encapsulates the history of salvation. It begins with God's creation of the world and his covenant with the people of Israel, and continues with the earthly life of Christ on the north wall. The addition of the Last Judgment completes the narrative. The papal court, representatives of the earthly church, participate in this narrative. It filled the gap between Christ's life and his second coming. Michelangelo's Last Judgment is among the most powerful renditions of this moment in the history of Christian art. Over 300 muscular figures in an infinite variety of dynamic poses fill the wall to its edges. Unlike the scenes on the walls and the ceilings, the Last Judgment is not bound by a painted border. It is all-encompassing and expands beyond the viewer's field of vision. Unlike the other sacred narratives which portray events of the past, this one implicates the viewer. It has yet to happen, and when it does, the viewer will be among those whose fate is determined. Despite the density of the figures, the composition is clearly organized into tiers and quadrants, with subgroups and meaningful pairings that facilitate the fresco's legibility. As a whole, it rises on the left and descends on the right, recalling the scales used for weighing souls in many depictions of the Last Judgment. Christ is in the fulcrum of this complex composition. The powerful muscular figure, he steps forward in a twisting gesture that sets in motion the final sorting of souls. Nestled under his raised arm, is the Virgin Mary. Michelangelo changed her pose from one of her open-armed pleading on humanity's behalf seen in the preparatory drawing to one of acquiescence to Christ's judgment. The time for intercession is over. Judgment has been passed. Directly below Christ, a group of wingless angels, their cheeks puffed with effort, sound trumpets that call the dead to rise, while two others hold open the books recording the deeds of the resurrected. The angel with the book of the damned emphatically angles it down to show the damned that their fate is justly based on their misdeeds. On the lower half of the composition, to Christ's right, the dead emerge from their graves, shedding their burial shrouds. Some rise up effortlessly, drawn by an invisible force, while others are assisted by Herculean angels, one of whom lifts a pair of souls that cling to a strand of rosary beads. The detail reaffirms a doctrine contested by Protestants, that prayer and good works, not just faith and divine grace, play a role in determining one's fate in the afterlife. Directly below, a risen body is caught in a violent tug-of-war, pulled on one end by two angels and on the other by a horned demon who has escaped through the crevice in the central mound. This breach in the earth provides a glimpse of the fires of hell. On the right of the composition, to Christ's left, demons drag the damned to hell, while angels beat down those who struggle to escape their fate. One soul is both pummeled by an angel and dragged by a demon head first. A money bag and 2 keys dangles from his chest. His is the sin of avarice. Another soul, exemplifying the sin of pride, dares to fight back, arrogantly contesting divine judgment, while a third is pulled by his genitalia as his sin was lust. These sins were specifically signaled out in sermons delivered to the papal court. In the lower right corner of the altar wall, Charon, the ferryman from the Greek mythology who transports souls to the underworld, swings his oar as he drives the damned onto hell's shores. In the lower right corner stands another mythological creature, Minos, his own carnal sinfulness indicated by the snake that bites at his genitals. He stands at the very edge of hell, judging the newcomers to determine their eternal punishment. While such details were meant to provoke terror in the viewer, Michelangelo's painting is primarily about the triumph of Christ. The realm of heaven dominates. The elect encircle Christ. They loom large in the foreground and extend far into the depth of the painting, dissolving the boundary from the picture plane. Some hold the instruments of their martyrdom: Andrew, the X-shaped cross, Lawrence, the gridiron, and Saint Sebastian, a bundle of arrows, to name only a few. Especially prominent are Saint John the Baptist and Saint Peter, who flank Christ to the left and the right and share his massive proportions. John, the last prophet, is identifiable by the camel pelt that covers his groin and dangles behind his legs, and Peter, the first pope, is identified by the key he returns to Christ. His role as keeper of the keys to the kingdom of heaven has ended. This gesture is a vivid reminder to the Pope that his reign as Christ Vicar was temporary. In the end, he too will answer to Christ. In the lunettes, which are the semicircular spaces at the top right and left, angels display the instruments of Christ's passion, thus connecting this triumphal moment to Christ's sacrificial death. This portion of the wall projects 1 foot forward, making it visible to the priest at the altar below as he commemorates Christ's sacrifice in the liturgy of the Eucharist. So as you can see, this is a very religiously based image that was intended to draw the viewer in and make them participate in the painting itself. So this slide just further breaks down everything that we spoke about on the last slide. So you can see on the left-hand side of the painting, you have the people rising up to heaven, whereas on the right-hand side, you have people being cast down into hell. And this here is an up-close of the image of Christ. As you can tell, he's a bit larger than life, just monumental in size, which is intended to show his importance. So you have that definite hierarchy of scale going on in this painting. So this is an image of Michelangelo's Pietà, which he carved when he was only 24 years old. And there are actually multiple versions of this, as he never felt that it was quite good enough. There's one, I believe it's located at the Duomo Gallery in Florence, that he actually took an axe to because he felt that it wasn't as good as it could possibly be. But this one is the one that is currently situated in the gallery at St. Peter's. And it's supposed to depict a Christian view of human suffering. But while he has gained much recognition as a painter for his work such as the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo had always considered himself to be a sculptor. Sculpting is what he had been classically trained to do, and his marble pieces are considered to be some of the best marble statues the world has ever seen. One of these famous sculptures resides in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City and is titled Pietà. It depicts the Virgin Mary holding the dead body of Jesus after he had been crucified. Michelangelo's skillful depiction of the scene is unmatched, as he carved in such a way that Mary's emotion is as heavy as the marble itself. Clearly mourning, Michelangelo was able to capture her heartbreak so perfectly and so timelessly that those admiring it today still feel her pain as they gaze with her at the dead body of Christ. No less significant is the way that he was able to carve Christ's body, which looks weak and limp despite being carved out of a strong stone. The way Michelangelo could get the stone so perfectly smooth and utilize the marble's slight translucence helped him to create a piece as timeless as the medium he used. So on this slide, you can see an image of St. Peter's Dome, which Michelangelo designed, and you can tell that it has the clerestory windows, which let in a lot of light, as well as featuring alternating pediments, so some are in a segmental arch and others are in a more triangular pediment. So the dome was not part of the original plan of St. Peter's. So St. Peter's, because it took so long to build, went through many architects, and I'm going to break down a little bit of that for you right now. So in 1546, Paul appointed Michelangelo chief architect of St. Peter's in a push to complete the project begun by Julius II in 1506. Paul had earlier entrusted the continuation of construction to Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, his preferred architect. Sangallo's plan for St. Peter had maintained some of the characteristics of Bramante's second plan for the building, although he extended one arm of the cross to create a nave, thus destroying the centrally planned scheme so important to Bramante. Sangallo constructed a huge wooden model of his plan between 1539 and 1546. By 1543, he had actually vaulted part of the nave, as can be seen in the Cancelliere fresco. Michelangelo reverted to Bramante's initial central plan, thickened the exterior walls, and removed secondary spaces, and in doing so unified the spatial volumes of the structure and made the interior especially luminous. This plan necessitated the destruction of an ambulatory on San Gallo's south hemicycle, a bold move considering the building cost already incurred. For the exterior of the building, Michelangelo again used a colossal order and maintained an appropriately formal vocabulary throughout. His employment of the huge flat pilasters around the building's curves and corners creates a rippling muscular surface accentuated by the step-like movement of the cornice. Where the hemicycles meet the central square of the plan, Michelangelo added a diagonal wall unit which softens the contours of the building, eliminating the sharp corners indicated on San Gallo's plan. Michelangelo's original design called for a hemispherical dome, which, like Bramante's, would have symbolized the cosmological power for St. Peter, buried beneath and by extension for the papacy. That dome provides one further connection between Julius's conception of the church and Paul's, a single worldwide religious power despite the inroads of the Reformation sects which, at the beginning of his reign, Paul III still thought he could reintegrate into the Roman Church. Even in the form of the ogival dome, which was ultimately built, this symbolism remains. The dome is raised on a high drum to give it visibility over the mass of the building. Like the walls of the building, the drum is treated as a sculptural volume, which applied double columns distinguishing the mass of the buttresses that support the dome and with the large pediments breaking the wall mass over the windows. So the last piece of Michelangelo's that we're going to look at today is arguably his most well-known and my personal favorite, and this is the David, which was constructed between 1501 and 1504. It is 17 feet tall, and it is made completely out of marble. It was originally situated in the Piazza Signoria outside of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence with his eyes facing Rome. But now the original is located in the Accademia in Florence, and there is a copy where the original would have stood. And this is because, like all natural materials, marble can degrade over time with rain and different changes in weather, so they figured best to move the original indoors and keep it in an environment which they can keep it safe from all of those external factors. So this piece is incredibly well made. The amount of detail and just how smooth he was able to get the marble. Remember, he doesn't have access to any power tools or lasers or anything that can help cut this cleanly. So he had to do all of this by hand, chiseling and sanding. And it was a bloody and long process to get this done. But David here is shown in contemplation, so this is actually before he throws the stone that will kill Goliath. And I'm sorry, I should have backed up and told you this before, but for those of you who don't know, this story comes out of 1 Samuel in the Old Testament of the Bible. David is a teenage boy, he's pretty small, and he has to defeat the giant Goliath. And understanding that story is critical to understanding this piece, not only because of the specific subject matter that's being portrayed, but also because of the meaning of this piece. And that's personally what makes this so special to me, I think, is understanding the background of why the Florentines chose to depict this. So this was commissioned by the Republic of Florence after they had overthrown the Medici. So the Medici family had been in Florence as the ruling family for quite some time, and they weren't a particularly nice group of people just letting everyone do their own thing. No, they wanted to be in control, and they wanted to have um, some more harsh conditions to make sure that people were following in line and so that the Medici could stay rich and popular, whereas everyone else kind of had to circulate and work for the Medici in some form or fashion. So David was really important to the people of of Florence. They considered it to be a symbol of Florence that they had overthrown their own Goliath. The society, the Republic of Florence was David, and they had defeated the Medici family. This was only temporary. Eventually, the Medici will make their way back into Florence and regain their popularity and influence, but for the time being, Florence became a republic because of their ability to overthrow these giant, really influential family. And so this particular statue is unlike the previous depictions, which portray the hero after his victory. So you'll notice, like we mentioned before, that this is him contemplating. But another thing that's different about this specific depiction of David is that he looks strong and capable, like he could actually throw the stone. And part of that is a concept that we know of as the strong arm of God. So that just means basically that it's not David throwing the stone, but God using David to throw the stone. So it is God's might that is throwing this stone at Goliath, not David himself. And so you can kind of see that here. Like I said, he looks athletic, he looks ready. And so that was one of the main things that Michelangelo wanted to depict here. It's very different than all of the other ones that came before it, but it held a really high value and importance within the city of Florence. And they once again put it outside of that Uffizi gallery, which was commissioned by the Medici as a means of saying, don't come back to Florence. Like I said, that didn't last. The Medici ultimately did come back to Florence, but for a time being, the Davids were defeating the Goliaths, and it felt really good for the Florentines to finally have that control again. And then the last thing that I really want to mention about the David is that it was just as revered during the time that it was built as it is now. So we know that that's not the case with a lot of artists, right? Most of the times their work is not truly valued until after the artist's death, but that was not the case for this piece. So this was actually commissioned to go on top of the Duomo, not at the very tip top, but up on the roof area. And they actually determined that it was so beautiful and so gorgeous that they couldn't bear putting it up so high so that no one could see it. And they actually held a public forum that determined that it should be moved to outside of the Uffizi gallery. And there is a replica of it in that original location today. But once again, the original has been moved to the Accademia. I have seen it in person, and once again, it's truly incredible just the amount of detail that Michelangelo was able to get into this sculpture. I'm not gonna lie, at first I did not understand why people would wait in a 4-hour long line to see one marble sculpture, but as soon as you lay eyes on it, you pretty quickly understand, because it really is as incredible, and it definitely is just as revered as it deserves to be. The next Renaissance artist that we are going to study is Raphael. He was born in Urbino, Italy in 1483, and he lived a relatively short life, dying in 1520 at only 37 years old. But while he did live a short life, he was able to accomplish a lot during that time period. So he was a pretty beloved artist in contrast to Michelangelo, who was skilled and talented, but also notoriously hard to work with. But because he was so easy to work with, Raphael was often called upon to paint for really high earning patrons. So he often painted frescoes and oil paintings, though he did get a little bit of involvement with the architectural field. Mostly it was just the decorations with the frescoes and the oil paintings. He didn't have many instances of carving or sculpting like Michelangelo did. But he was incredibly creative in his depictions. His Transfiguration is the last painting that he ever did, and we'll look at that. And it kind of separates out the high Renaissance style. The Transfiguration almost leans into that Mannerist style, which follows the Renaissance. But like I said, he was beloved. The Pope wept at his death. But all of the money that he earned in his lifetime, he left for restoration of the Pantheon. And just to give you a little glimpse into the timeline, at the time that Raphael was alive, Leonardo da Vinci was already an older man. So he wasn't necessarily working at exactly the same time. A lot of their stuff overlaps, just in terms of age, but in general, Leonardo has done his works. He's completed most of what we know him for, and Raphael is just on the other end of that in those later years of Leonardo's life. So the image that you see here is known as the betrothal of the Virgin or the marriage of the Virgin, and it is part of an altarpiece created for the church at Città di Castello in Italy and shows the marriage of the Virgin Mary and Saint Joseph. The painting, an oil on panel, was completed in 1504 and is an example of Raphael's increasing maturity and confidence as an artist. His colors here are vibrant, and the faces of his character are specific. In this painting, Raphael shows off his mastery of perspective, for the painting is dominated by a distinctly Italian Renaissance round temple in the background, in the frieze of which the painter has cleverly painted his name and below it the date. So if you look right here, that's where Raphael signed this painting. The front and back doors of this temple are open, and through it the viewer can see a bit of a hazy sfumato painted background of hills and sky. And sfumato is something that we've seen in a lot of these paintings up until this point, but essentially it just means hazy or blurry. Sometimes we consider it to be smoky. We see it a lot in Leonardo paintings, but you can also clearly see it here through this little open door. The temple sits on a cascade of steps that leads down to a plaza with walkways that are picked out in a reddish stone. People in the Renaissance garb gather in small groups, seemingly oblivious to the rather momentous marriage that is happening in the foreground. In the foreground, a richly attired high priest clasps the hands of both Mary and Joseph as Joseph prepares to place a ring on Mary's finger. Behind her stands a group of soft-eyed women, her kinswomen perhaps, whose attire is only a little less stupendous than the priest. At the extreme left, the girl in red looks out to us wistfully. Behind Joseph stands a crowd of disappointed suitors. Indeed, the one standing next to Joseph breaks his wand over his knee in what seems like resignation, while another, sad-looking chap also bends his. As the viewer can see, the rod that Joseph holds burst into flower, and the rods of the other suitors haven't. Mary, dressed in traditional red gown and blue cloak, with her hair held back by gauzy veils, looks like a virgin. Joseph, dressed in something like a priest cassock with his saffron-colored cloak draped elaborately around him, looks a bit careworn and older than his bride. Some legends claim he was a widower. Presaging the man who would become his foster son, he is the only one of the suitors to wear a beard. He is also the only person in the picture who is barefoot. This painting is now located in the Pinacoteca di Brera, an art museum in Milan, Italy. So, as I mentioned earlier, Raphael was incredibly beloved by the Pope, and Pope Julius II actually commissioned Raphael to paint and design the papal apartments, which are part of the Vatican City museums today. The apartments include 4 rooms set up in a linear style so that one can easily walk from one room into another. These rooms are intended to send a message about papal authority and the strength of the Catholic Church, which is important during the early 1500s as it is on the cusp of the Protestant Reformation. The middle 2 rooms, the Stanza del Segnatura and the Stanza di Eleuterio, intensely showcase this message of the papal apartments. The first room that Raphael worked on, the Stanza della Segnatura, I'm so sorry about the pronunciation, y'all, details the control that the papacy has over all aspects of learning and secular knowledge. The 4 walls are each frescoed to showcase a different theme. On one wall is a painting about theology, which highlights the Eucharist. Another wall showcases Apollo and the Muses, which represents art and music. Across from the art and music wall is a fresco about justice, accenting papal authority over the law. On the final wall sits the famous School of Athens fresco, which showcases the importance of philosophy. In this fresco, which features the likes of Plato and Aristotle, portraits of Raphael's contemporaries, including Michelangelo, make an appearance. While the School of Athens fresco is the most famous, it must be viewed in the context of the entire room. The philosophy fresco sits directly across from the theology fresco. By working together, these frescoes showcase the fullness of papal authority. This message pairs well with the purpose of the room, as this was a library where the papal seal was kept. Beneath the frescoes, bookshelves lined the walls containing books pertaining to the subject above. This allows the fresco to not only be decorative but also functional within the space. The next room, the Stanza di Eleuterio, also carried a message about papal authority, as its images showcase times in which the papacy was challenged. To reiterate, this is incredibly important as the Protestant Reformation was gearing up during the early 1500s. While there are 4 images in the space, the one that highlights this best is the Mass Epiphania. In this image, a priest in the moment of the Eucharist doubts the miracle of transubstantiation. The wafer begins to bleed, proving that the bread has become the body of Christ. Proving the miracle of transubstantiation is incredibly important to the Catholic faith, as it is one of the main things that Protestants would reject when splitting from the Catholic Church. Altogether, the papal apartments serve to showcase the broad reach and intense power of the Catholic Church. However, these works were not the only works by Raphael intended to showcase the authority of the papacy. Under the direction of Pope Leo X, Raphael designed a series of tapestries to be hung in the Sistine Chapel. The Sistine Chapel tapestries were incredibly expensive to make, as the designs had to be sent to the Netherlands to be woven together. Because of the expense, this showcased the wealth and therefore the power of the papacy. On this slide, you can see Raphael's Transfiguration, which was the last painting before his death. It eventually hung over his funeral bier in the Pantheon by his own request. So, Transfiguration was created beginning in 1516 and was thought to be finished by his student of art, Giulio Romano, in 1520 after Raphael's premature death. Cardinal Giulio de' Medici commissioned Raphael to paint Transfiguration for the city of Narbonne in France. The painting was kept personally by the Pope after Raphael's untimely death until he donated it to the Church of San Pietro in Rome. The painting is now housed in the Vatican Museum. The artistic composition is divided into two distinct parts. Transfiguration relates to successive stories of the Gospel of Matthew. The upper part of the painting depicts Christ elevated in front of billowing, illuminated clouds, and on either side of him are the prophets Elijah and Moses. In the lower portion of the painting, the apostles are depicted, trying unsuccessfully to rid the possessed boy of demons. The upper portion shows a transfigured Christ appearing to be performing a miracle, curing the boy and ridding him of evil. On the most obvious level, this painting can be interpreted as the split between the flaws of men depicted in the lower half and the redemptive power of Christ in the upper half of the painting. There are two figures kneeling to the left of Christ who are martyrs, Saint Agapitus and Saint Felicissimus, who were deacons seized during the prosecutions of Emperor Valerian. Transfiguration's dimensions are 159 inches by 109 inches. Raphael preferred painting on canvas, but this painting was done with oil paints on wood as the chosen mediums. Raphael actually showed advanced indications of mannerism and Baroque period painting techniques in this painting. The stylized, contorted poses of the lower half figures indicate mannerism. The dramatic tension within these figures and the liberal use of light to dark or chiaroscuro contrast represents the Baroque period of exaggerated motion to produce drama, tension, exuberance, or enlightenment. Transfiguration was ahead of its time, just as Raphael's death came too soon. The next artist that we're going to talk about is Donatello. He is largely considered to be the first Renaissance sculptor, and this image here is a picture of his figure outside of the Uffizi Museum in Florence. So Donatello was born in Florence in 1386 and died in 1466. Therefore, he's much older than Raphael and Michelangelo. He died well before they came of age. But he still had a great deal of influence over their artwork. He studied classical sculpture and traveled across Italy during his career, so you can see the influence of several different cities within his work. He would be the first artist to revive the nude male sculptures since antiquity with his freestanding bronze David, which we'll talk about in a moment. He is best known for his in-the-round statues, so he didn't necessarily carve relief sculptures very often. On this slide, you can see some additional notes on Donatello. So as I mentioned, he was in Florence. That's where he was primarily located, though he did travel elsewhere. But he also collaborated fairly often with other artists, most famously with Ghiberti, who designed the doors on the Florence baptistry. The picture that you see here is of St. John the Evangelist, which now sits in the Duomo. And St. John is the patron saint of Florence, so it's not uncommon to see him depicted around the city. It's in most of their churches and a fair amount of their public buildings as well. And so this work marks a decisive step forward from the late Gothic style towards the naturalism and the rendering of human feelings. So you can tell that he has a very stoic face. So all of that is still very idealized, but the hands and the fold of the cloth and the legs are far more realistic than anything else that we have seen to this point. So this is Donatello's most famous work, and it is his bronze David for the court of his Palazzo de' Medici. And this is the first freestanding nude since ancient times, and it definitely represented an allegory of civic virtues triumphing over brutality and irrationality. So remember that the Florentines really viewed David to be their symbol. This wasn't quite to the same degree that we saw the symbolism with Michelangelo's David, just because the Medici were still in the city at this point. But nonetheless, the Florentines still saw aspects of their society which they considered to be David's, which they were overcoming, including the brutality and irrationality just mentioned. And we do consider this to be the first major work of Renaissance sculptures. So just a little bit more detail here. Donatello created 2 statues depicting David during his career. His very first commissioned work was a marble rendition of the biblical hero created around 1408. It was a fairly traditional piece that Donatello created in his early 20s and did not feature what would become his trademark naturalism. It is possible that his study of David's character could have informed his later and much more popular bronze statue of David and the head of Goliath. The second David was a commission from the Medici family in the 1430s. It was the first freestanding bronze statue of the Renaissance. The hero is pictured here after defeating Goliath. He is nude except for his boots and a hat topped with a laurel. Donatello borrowed from ancient Rome culture when including the laurel, as it is a symbol of victory. Unlike Michelangelo's David, Donatello's David is extremely realistic and a prime example of Renaissance naturalism. His body appears lithe as he stands with one foot atop Goliath's decapitated head. His small frame and almost effeminate disposition imply his victory is due to God's assistance. He holds a sword, which looks huge in proportion to his body, and he smiles proudly. Donatello's David was also the first male nude statue since classical antiquity. It is strikingly different from classical depictions of male nudes. To this day, it remains a groundbreaking achievement and a testament to Donatello's mastery in bronze work. It is housed in the Bargello Museum in Florence. So one of the most critical buildings from the Renaissance is the cathedral in Florence. It has become a staple of Renaissance style, mostly because of the dome that was constructed by Filippo Brunelleschi in 1425. The Basilica di Santa Maria del Fiore, St. Mary of the Flower, nicknamed the Duomo after the enormous octagonal dome on its east end, is the Cathedral of Florence, Italy, and arguably the birthplace of the Renaissance. A cathedral is a bishop's church. There are many other Catholic churches in Florence, many of them associated with the Renaissance, including the Santa Maria Novella, the Santa Croce, and the Bernacchi Chapel. However, the Duomo is the home church of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Florence, which traces its roots to 394 CE. Although its construction was begun in 1296, the cathedral did not get the set structure that gives it its name until 1436. The east end of the church was open to the elements or covered with a flat, unstable roofing for more than a century. The huge octagonal shape proved daunting to engineers and architects. Italian architects were familiar with circular domed shapes, such as the Pantheon in Rome. However, these domes were constructed with concrete. The recipe for concrete had been lost in the Dark Ages. Medieval Gothic cathedrals, such as the Notre Dame de Paris in France, relied on flying buttresses to support their massive stone weight. Architects and engineers of the budding Renaissance were determined to not use the flamboyant Gothic style or flying buttresses. They wanted to look back at the simple, clean lines of their Roman past. The architect Filippo Brunelleschi came up with a solution. The dome is actually 2 domes. The inner dome is made of sandstone and marble, and the outer dome is made of brick and mortar, each brick carefully designed, shaped, fired to support the dome. The dome was constructed without any supports beneath it. The dome was an immediate success, and Brunelleschi became the chief architect associated with the Renaissance. In an ironic twist, the marble facade of the cathedral, not visible in this photograph, um, was only completed in the late 1800s, during a period when the medieval, not Renaissance, art was popular. The birthplace of the Renaissance does have a medieval face. So when I say you can't really see that, because the facade is going to be over down on this end, it is a truly beautiful facade, but it really does not match the Roman Renaissance style that they were going for. So one thing that short passage didn't mention was that Brunelleschi actually went to Rome to study ancient Roman architecture, and that's where he got a lot of his ideas from. And then he also is credited for developing a system known as linear perspective. If you've ever taken a drawing class as part of your design curriculum, you'll know that linear perspective is an incredibly useful tool. And it is adopted by artists in Italy and throughout Europe. And like I said, we still teach it today. You've got 1-point and 2-point linear perspectives being the most popular types. And they're generally taught in like intro to drawing courses. So now we're going to move on and talk about Ghiberti, who I've mentioned several times throughout. Lorenzo di Cione Ghiberti was born in Pelago near Florence, Italy in 1378. He was well trained by his father, who was a well-respected goldsmith in Florence. In 1392, he was admitted to the Silk and Gold Guild as an apprentice, and by 1398 had passed his examination to become a guildmaster goldsmith. In 1400, he traveled to Rimini to escape the plague in Florence and received further training as a painter, assisting in the completion of the wall frescoes at the castle of Carlo I Malatesta. In 1401, Lorenzo Ghiberti began work for a commission sponsored by the Arte di Calimala to make a pair of bronze doors for the baptistry of Florence. 6 other artists also applied, including Brunelleschi and Jacopo della Quercia. Ghiberti won the commission with his trial piece of a bronze relief of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. The original plan was for 2 doors to depict various scenes from the Old Testament, but the plan was later changed to include scenes from the New Testament. Ghiberti was commissioned to work on the baptistry's second set of doors, with the first set completed by the artist Andrea Pisano in the early 14th century. So on this slide, you can see an image of those doors, which are his most famous work, and you can see that there are 10 panels with biblical scenes that are depicted in order, and we're going to go over these again in a couple of slides. So this next little section is going to be on these doors. Alright, so here's a bit of the backstory of the doors that Ghiberti is famous for. So in 1401, there was a competition for the first set of bronze doors for the baptistry of the Florence Cathedral. Brunelleschi ended up being the runner-up, so he actually didn't get the commission, but the original plan was for the doors to depict only Old Testament scenes, and the trial piece that Ghiberti submitted was of the sacrifice of Isaac. However, the plan eventually changed so that New Testament scenes were also included. Ghiberti set up a large workshop where many artists trained, including Donatello, and he reinvented the lost wax casting of bronze casting used by the ancient Romans. And to give you just like a very brief overview of what the lost wax method entails, you essentially carve whatever sculpture that you're wanting to make out of wax. You then make a mold of the wax and then pour the bronze into the mold, and the wax melts away. So it's a very sophisticated way to do that. It takes time, and you have to make sure that your bronze is at exactly the right heat to melt the wax at just the perfect amount of time and that everything can drain properly. It's a very taxing method of ways to pour bronze, but it's also one of the most effective. After the first set of doors was completed, Ghiberti was commissioned to produce a second set for another door in the church with the Old Testament scenes. These are more naturalistic with perspective and greater idealization of subject, and Michelangelo dubbed them the Gates of Paradise. And this is a monument to the age of humanism. So we're going to see a lot of those really naturalistic forms in each of these panels, which is what the Renaissance was ultimately best known for. So while you don't see a ton of detail on these doors from this particular picture, you can see how they look in comparison to the rest of the baptistry. So Michelangelo likened the gilded bronze doors of Florence's baptistry of San Giovanni to the gates of paradise. The phrase stuck for reasons that anyone who has seen them will understand. Combining a goldsmith's delicacy with a foundryman's brava, sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti condensed the Old Testament into 10 panels to produce one of the defining masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance. Since their installation in 1452, the doors have withstood a variety of near-biblical catastrophes: a torrential flood, vandalism, overzealous polishing, and caustic air pollution. When the doors were finally removed for restoration from the facade of the 11th century octagonal baptistry in 1990, they looked dull and grimy, but the worst damage was occurring almost invisibly. Diagnostic studies revealed that fluctuations in humidity were causing unstable oxides on the bronze beneath the gilding to dissolve and recrystallize, creating minute craters and blistering the gold on the surface. So they have done a lot of work to restore these to make sure that we don't lose them, since they are considered to be one of the ultimate defining pieces of the Renaissance. So here are some more facts about those gates of paradise. They are 17 feet tall, and being entirely made out of bronze, they weigh about 3 tons, so they are quite heavy. They told a complex story very logically, gracefully, and convincingly. It really walks you through the Old Testament. And this was seen as like a textbook for later generations of Italian artists. They would go and study these doors as much as they possibly could. And the doors were recently restored, and it took 25 years, and they actually separated some of these golden panels from the door and put them in part of a traveling exhibit. I believe it came to 6 American cities. The originals now sit sealed in an oxygen-free chamber inside the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo. And I have personally seen these. They are considerably more degraded than the copies that now hang on the baptistry. So they're doing what they can to protect them, because having been exposed to the elements for so long, they definitely started to wear away, and so that's why there's been all of these efforts to take these really amazing pieces and to put them in safer spaces. So just as we saw with Michelangelo's David, they're trying to minimize the damage that can be done. So as I mentioned, these panels were incredibly detailed. This one is of the creation scenes, so one thing that you can note here is that it's definitely a scene of action. We see a lot of movement happening. So in the lower left-hand corner, you can see here God drawing Adam into life, and you can almost see that really similar shape to Michelangelo's creation of Adam. The arms are kind of extended the same way. While this is obviously a far more naturalistic look at it, it does still have some of that shape. And then in the center here, so you're seeing multiple scenes kind of being depicted all at once. This part here, you have God drawing Eve out of Adam's side. And then in the upper left-hand corner, the couple can be seen, right here. The couple can be seen considering eating the fruit of the forbidden tree, which would ultimately cast them out of Eden. So this scene, while it still depicts a lot of movement like we saw in the last image, you can clearly see one narrative here. So you have down here David defeating Goliath. Like all of the other David scenes that we have seen, like I said, David is a real symbol of Florence, and so he was heavily revered. And when you're considering the Old Testament, this is one of the most famous stories, which is why it made that top 10 of ones that needed to be depicted on the doors. But like I said, this panel follows a really clear narrative, much clearer than the creation that we just talked about. However, you can still see a lot of that same movement going on. So you have a lot of guys here in like full action. And so that was one of those pieces of naturalism that Ghiberti was famous for. So now we're going to discuss the Della Robbia family, and this was a family of sculptors like I just mentioned. With Luca being an early Renaissance sculptor, and then we have Andrea and Giovanni, and you can kind of see how they all relate to one another and what that timeline would look like. One of the most famous, and so the one that we're really going to talk about today, is going to be Luca. And one of the main things that he did was develop a pottery glaze that made creations more durable in the outdoors, and thus it was used on building exteriors quite often. So, in the rich artistic culture of 15th century Florence, the sculptor Luca della Robbia won renown for his innovations in the medium of glazed terracotta. Praised as new, useful, and most beautiful, this distinctive technique involved the application of colorful, reflective glazes to sculptures fired in clay. Luca's methods established a durable and shining surface for ceramic sculpture of many kinds, from independent statues in the round to narrative reliefs and architectural ornament. His family workshop specialized in depictions of sacred history and devotional images of the Madonna and Christ child for a variety of settings, including altars, chapels within churches, exterior walls and gates, and the domestic realm. The sculpture's humble materials expressed the spiritual value of humility, exalted by a luminous surface, while the skill with which they were fashioned and the visual clarity of the medium made them easy to read and understand. Through pure expressive color and a refreshing simplicity of means, Della Robbia terracottas illuminated the themes of salvation through the Christian faith. Luca collaborated closely for decades with his nephew Andrea, who entered his workshop by 1451 and inherited it in 1482. 5 of Andrea's children joined the enterprise, carrying the family's art into the 16th century. As their range of commissions grew, the Della Robbia increasingly explored other genres, such as portraiture, still life, landscape, and allegory, alongside canonical religious subjects. Della Robbia's sculptures still grace the churches and squares of Florence and other Italian cities, while portable reliefs, statuettes, and a bust of the family, bust made by the family, adorned museums throughout the world. This major lone exhibition is the first devoted to Della Robbia in the United States. So this is one that was at the National Gallery of Art. They actually were able to display a lot of these, and that's where these images that you're going to see today come from. So here you can see a cantoria by Luca della Robbia. And this is his first known commission. And it would have served as a singing loft, but you can tell that even something that was meant to be placed up high, it was full of detail. So you can see detail truly everywhere on this piece. This piece is missing his signature bright colors, but we're going to take a look at that on the next slide. So on this slide, you can see some more images by the family. On the left, you see one by Andrea, and on the right, you see another made by Luca. And so once again, the most innovative part of their sculptures is their glazing method that they would have used with fired clay. It's one that's still pretty commonly used today, and you can see how vibrant and rich each of the colors are, which is really what their signature was. If you think back, this is as close as we're going to get to the polychromy that was really popular throughout Greece. So while we saw that true Renaissance revival in terms of the shape of, true Greek revival in terms of the shape of the sculptures, because most of the paint had worn off of the pieces from antiquity, we didn't really see much polychroming throughout the Renaissance. However, this once again brings in that really bright color that had been popular for a long time. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears just a little bit to look at the next phase of the Renaissance, and that's going to be this Baroque period. We actually don't consider this to be the Renaissance. It's part of its own thing, and its own movement, because it's kind of a reaction to the Vitruvian orders of the High Renaissance. So those were very structured, very rigid. The Baroque is going to kind of eliminate that, right? Like they want to have that creativity in there. However, they did this in a way that a lot of people didn't like at the time, which is where we get the Baroque name from. It means misshapen, irregular, or ugly. So it wasn't necessarily something that people enjoyed. It actually had a pretty harsh reaction during its day. But some of the most famous buildings are from this time period, and they really encapsulate the ideas of creativity and beauty in ways that we hadn't quite seen it done before. So like I mentioned, there's a lot more freedom and spirit and creativity involved here because it's not based on an antique framework. The Jesuits tried to seize the moment as a reaction against classics. They tried to get people back into the church, so churches embraced the Baroque movement. So remember, 1600 and later is after the Protestant Reformation. The church needs to gain power again. It had been losing quite a bit. So the main building that we are going to look at, know that there is a lot more to the Baroque period than just what we're going to discuss today. We spent a lot more time on the High Renaissance, but the main thing that we are going to look at today is St. Peter's, which is an early Baroque building. Okay, so St. Peter's Basilica is not a cathedral. Remember, we just discussed with the Duomo in Florence what it takes to be considered a cathedral. This is believed to be the place where St. Peter was crucified, and the altar marks his burial place. So that's going to be below the baldacchino, which we'll look at in just a moment. The chief architects were Bramante, Michelangelo, and Bernini. However, there's a lot of moving parts in this timeline, right? So because it took so long to build and so long to design, we do see Bramante dies, so Michelangelo has to take over, and then Michelangelo leaves for a little while, and then he comes back, and then he dies, so Bernini takes over, and there's just a lot of shifting that goes on during this time that really affects the design of the plan overall. So the interiors are at an incredibly large scale, which appeals to the emotions. You walk in and you feel so small, which is exactly how you would want somebody to feel when they are walking into such a holy space, right? You want it to feel, um, you want people to feel this huge sense of reverence and that something so grand, that they've just walked into. So there's curves, there's spirals, there's a lot of gilded ornaments. It's a very theatrical space, so it's intended to make you feel something. Um, but yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the actual process of how we ended up with this design on the next slide. All right, so Pope Julius II commissioned Bramante to build a new basilica, and this involved demolishing the old St. Peter's Basilica that had been erected by Constantine in the 4th century. This ancient church was in disrepair, but tearing it down was a bold maneuver that gives us a sense of enormous ambition of Pope Julius II, both for the papacy as well as for himself. So remember, he's responding to the Protestant Reformation by building something that is so big and so grand that it states the power of the Vatican. So this site is a very holy one, according to the church. It's the site of the burial of St. Peter. Bramante did the first plan for this new church, and he proposed an enormous, centrally planned church in the shape of a Greek cross, enclosed within a square with an enormous dome over the center and smaller domes and half domes radiating out. When Bramante died, Raphael took over as the chief architect for St. Peter's, and when Raphael died, Michelangelo took over. Both Michelangelo and Raphael made substantial changes to Bramante's original plan. Nonetheless, the experience of being inside St. Peter's is awe-inspiring. So the two basic plan types of the church are the basilica and the central plan. The basilica, with its long axis that focuses its attention on the altar, has been the most popular type of church plan because of its practicality. The other popular type of church plan is a central plan that is usually based either in the shape of a circle or on a Greek cross, which is just a cross but it has equal sections, so it's more like an X. These are central plans because the measurements are all equidistant from the center. This type of church, influenced by classical architecture, was very popular among high Renaissance architects. Besides the influence of ancient Roman architecture, the circle had spiritual associations. The circle, which has no beginning and no end, symbolized the perfection and eternal nature of God. For some thinkers in antiquity and the Renaissance, the universe itself was constructed in the form of concentric circles with the sun, moon, and stars moving in circular orbits around the earth. Bramante's original design was for a central plan. However, as built, the church combines elements of a central plan with the longer nave of a basilica. So all of those elements that I just mentioned can be clearly seen here. So you have this like perfect square here that would have been formed. However, it turned into a basilica plan. And then you can also see the elements of Baroque design. So had this been done in the High Renaissance, this area out here would have been a perfect circle. However, we can see that they chose to make this in an ovular shape. So it's actually in an oval instead of a circle. And this was done really intentionally. And it does solidify this to be a Baroque building rather than a Renaissance building, despite the fact that its earliest designs did come out of the Renaissance. So in this image, you can see two key features that we're about to discuss: the facade of the church as well as the dome, which was designed by Michelangelo. St. Peter's is approached via St. Peter's Square, an elliptical forecourt encircled by a Doric colonnade derived from Greek architecture. It ends at the facade of St. Peter's, which is 376 feet wide and 150 feet high. Designed by Carlo Maderno, The facade features a giant order of Corinthian columns, each 90 feet high, and is topped by 13 statues. Christ, flanked by 11 of the apostles, excluding Peter, plus John the Baptist. At the ground level, it is approached by steps guarded by two 18 feet high statues of Saints Peter and Paul. The Basilica of St. Peter's is one of four major basilicas in Rome, and others being the Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Paul, and St. John Lateran. But it is the Dome of St. Peter's, the tallest dome in the world, that dominates the skyline of Rome. Designed largely by Michelangelo and built during the short but active papacy of Sixtus V by Michelangelo's pupil Giacomo della Porta, the dome rests on four pendentives and massive piers, each 60 feet thick. It was Michelangelo who increased the size and strength of the load-bearing structure without destroying the central unity of Bramante's original design. Intermediate rivals of St. Peter's dome include the Florence Cathedral of the early Renaissance designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, which was completed in 1434. So yes, as you can see here, you have this really tall dome. It does look a little bit out of proportion from this angle just because of the way that the facade sits on this church. However, that dome is actually equally as wide as what we can see here on the church is like nave, so all of this area here. However, just because of the recession into space, you can see that the dome looks smaller from this angle than it actually is. So this slide just kind of breaks down the parts of a basilica floor plan. So you have the west entrance, which includes kind of the nave here, and then you have the transept, which crosses it. The altar would have been somewhere under the dome here, as well as the apse and the side aisles, which would have followed right inside by the normal aisles down the nave. And then the apse, like I said, is this part back here. So here you can see the floor plan for St. Peter's. This here is going to be the baldacchino and the papal altar. So it sits right in the center, and that is where St. Peter is believed to be buried. As you can tell, it did have a centralized floor plan at one point. However, this nave was further extended down, so it's no longer centrally planned, and that's why we consider it to be a basilica plan. So like I mentioned before, St. Peter's is considered to be an incredibly important religious site for the Christian faith. Therefore, there's actually an extensive map of almost tunnels below St. Peter's. So 12 here, that's where I'm pretty sure he's believed to be buried. But you also have all sorts of other things going on below the building itself, once again marking this as an incredibly holy site. And this slide just kind of continues off of what I spoke about on the last slide. You can see that church's plan here as these like major sections. Sorry, this is a horrible drawing. But you have that main plan that you can see sits on top of those grottos. Sorry, that's the interior. This is the plan as we see it now, this purple line along the outside. So on this slide, you can see an image of the nave at St. Peter's. And like I mentioned before, this space is designed to make you feel reverent and to feel small. So to give you some scale, these are probably about 4 feet. So most people would be taller than that, but you would barely reach the base of the columns. You would have quite a bit of space above your head, and it is heavily ornamented throughout the entire space. You see some of the most famous pieces of work. You can't quite see them in this image. This down here at the end is the baldacchino, which we'll discuss in just a moment. But this is also the place that houses some of the really famous Renaissance sculptures and really religiously important sculptures, such as Michelangelo's Pietà. So now we're going to take a look at the baldacchino, which is the monumental canopy that covers the shrine of St. Peter. It's made of dark bronze accented with gold vine leaves, and it was sculpted from 1624 to 1633 under the direction of Barberini Pope Urban VIII, who oversaw the Baroque redecoration of much of Rome. So the spiral columns derive their shapes from the columns in the original St. Peter's Basilica built by Constantine, and legend had it that they came from Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. So they were intended to be incredibly important pieces, considering St. Peter is considered to be the founder of the Christian church. So this is an image of the baldacchino, and you can see here people's heads, so you can tell just how large and monumental this would have been. Still is. It's still very, very large, obviously. And down below it, that's believed to be Peter's tomb. And then you can see those features that we just spoke about. So it is all made out of bronze. It's incredibly heavy. But you do see those like spiraling columns here, which are really what this piece is most well known for. So we've discussed this dome many times. It is the tallest dome in the world, but it does use a lot of the same ideas that were put into place while building the Florence dome. So the one that's on the Duomo. This one lets in a lot of natural light. It has that like clerestory layer, which is important because you want all of the light to shine in down on that grave of St. Peter. But yes, very highly decorated and very well designed. So in the west end of the basilica, you can see Bernini's throne of St. Peter. This was built in 1624. So this is particularly important religiously because it is believed to house the relic of the wooden throne that belongs to the apostle St. Peter. And the relic is enclosed in a sculpted gilt bronze casing designed by Bernini. And then in 2012, Pope Benedict actually described the chair as a symbol of the special mission of Peter and his successors to tend to Christ's flock, keeping it united in faith and charity. So like I said, it was incredibly important to the religion. One of the things that also is added to this feature that makes it added to this sculpture that makes it particularly interesting is this use of light. So he really thought about the entire space around it. This is actually a window here that you see, and it lets the light fall exactly down onto the like throne area. But then furthermore, even when there's not like light coming through that window, you have these gold, they almost look like spikes, but they're intended to look like rays of sunshine. So here you can see that in just a little bit more detail. So this chair here is where it is believed that he would have, where his chair would be encased. And then you can see those little spikes of sun rays again. So the Baroque ornament wasn't actually unlike anything that we had seen before. While it definitely used these things in different ways, we still see the Balencian molding. You see a lot of polychroming and arabesque features. We do see a lot of mirrors being made at this time, and they often have architectural frames. Then you also see the cartouche and the medallion, which we've studied all of these terms before. So here you can see an image of the Belection molding, which is just talking about the profile of this molding, what that would have looked like. So it creates a shape that we see pretty often in terms of molding, and especially in crown molding. Polychroming is also a technique that we see a lot, though it's not done with paint the way that the Greek art was done. As you can tell here, this is polychroming using different colors of marble and different types of stone to create a polychromed look. So it has a lot of color to it, but that color is actually built into the material rather than being layered over top. So these are the arabesque features, which are pretty floral, just nice little motifs that we see quite often. While not done necessarily in the same way that actual Arabs would have done it, because you can see like faces in here, so obviously Islamic art doesn't allow you to have that kind of depiction. Um, the people of the Baroque period took a lot of those same flowing elements and made them their own by adding elements such as the faces, such as the true flowers. We don't just see curvilinear lines, but we do get to see some actual flora and fauna depicted in these scenes while still maintaining that arabesque, light, airy, floral style. So on this slide, you see a maiolica, which is a tin glazed pottery decorated in colors. Usually they would have a white background. I believe this is a recreation, so it's not quite the same. But these date back to the Renaissance period, and they used terracotta, I believe, to make these. And so they would often depict scenes of historical and mythical stories, and they would be used, I believe, as just like your normal tableware. Here you can see a mirror with an architectural frame, and one thing that's important to note about the um, Renaissance in general is that art was always displayed with careful thought as to how it was to be displayed. So, most of these artists would provide their own frame or get someone to build a frame that was meant to be seen as part of the artwork, and the mirrors were no different. So, they had these really elaborate frames. We can tell that this one is clearly very architecturally based. So, we have those columns, we have an entablature, and we see a lot of those architectural elements down to even the dentils at the top. But like I said, the frames are pretty important. They're just as important as the pieces of art that are inside of the frames. So here you can see a cartouche, which is just a carved tablet or drawing representing a scroll with rolled up ends. So you can see that here. See that a little bit here. Oftentimes they would have had words on them depicting some type of message that they wanted to get across. Then lastly, we see a medallion. It's exactly what you think of when you think of any standard medallion. These could be used on furniture, on architecture, really anywhere that they wanted an added element of decoration. Sometimes these could be decorated with family seals. This one's pretty simple, but they could be quite elaborate. So the next style that we're going to look at is the Rococo style. Now, we are not going to really get into this one today, just because France will become much more well known for their Rococo style than the Italian style, which is a little bit more crude. It's still really ornate, but it's not going to be done in the same like way that the French do it. The French really take Rococo and just blow it out of the water. So it did begin in Italy, but it was developed extensively later in France, kind of like I just mentioned. And this happened as the political power of the world shifted from Italy to France. So remember, while France will stay a Catholic country for quite some time, as the Catholic Church starts to decline, so does the Italian power there, right? So especially since Italy was mostly city states at this time, it wasn't really unified. France had a lot greater ability to become a world powerhouse, and that's when we're going to see artists really flock to France for benefactors such as Louis the 14th. And lastly, we can see some foreign influence following the Rococo period. So you have a lot of influence from France. Like I said, France becomes quite the world powerhouse as Italy begins to fall. And Napoleon would eventually conquer Italy for 10 months and brought the French Empire style into the country. But the Italians were more exuberant and imaginative and really expanded upon the French Empire style. All right, you all, we have made it to the end. So thank you so much for sticking by me. I know this was a super long lecture, but I think there was a lot of really important material to get across to you. So thank you so much for paying attention and holding up. So these next few slides that we're going to flip through, it's just like 5 or 6. I want to see if you can identify the images of the pictures that are being depicted. So I'm just going to pause it for a minute and you can see which style of chair this is, and then I will go ahead and confirm. All right, so if you identified this chair as the Scabello chair, you would be correct. You'll notice that it looks a lot like a stool and has that very distinctive triangular shape on top. All right, so once again, I'm going to give you another quick second to look at this one and try to identify it. All right, so this is a cassone, which is just the bench slash chest. It would have had some storage down inside it. And as you can tell, this one is quite elaborate. All right, so if you can take a moment, you can feel free to flip back through your slides and identify what this chair is. All right, so this is the Dante chair, and remember the main aspect to see here is that it is upholstered and it uses that crewel base. All right, so just look at this one for a minute. I want to draw your attention to how functional it is. It's kind of a folding chair, so it would have been able to be moved around a lot. So see if you can remember what chair this is. All right, so if you determined that this was the monastery chair, you would be correct. This was often used in monasteries because it could be so easily transported from place to place. All right, last one. So let's see if you can identify this one real quick. All right, so this is a casapanca, and it is just a bench, but it probably would have had some storage as well. All right, so once again, thank you so much for sticking with me for all of this. I know it was really long, but good luck on the rest of your module, and I'll see you next time when we dive into the French styles.